Welcome to Tudor London, a city that was as alive as it was, actively trying to eliminate you. Picture it. The cobbled streets buzz with merchants, horses clatter past carrying nobles and their egos, and from somewhere, always, there's the faint suspicious trickle of something you hope is just rainwater. This was not the London of glittering palaces and polished marble. This was the London of open drains, rotting meat stalls, and a fragrance that could strip paint. If smells could kill, Londoners were already halfway to heaven. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you're listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The Tudor capital was a paradox of progress and pestilence. On one hand, it was the beating heart of trade, theatre and culture. On the other, it was a bacterial playground, a living science experiment without the science part. People crowded into wooden homes stacked so tightly together that one good sneeze could practically cross a street. There were no sewers, no sanitation, and absolutely no understanding of what caused disease. Germ theory wouldn't show up for another 3 centuries, and in the meantime, Tudor London ran on a medical philosophy, best described as good luck. The streets were the city's digestive system, and they weren't doing well. Every day, thousands of people dumped their chamber pots into the gutters. Human waste flowed alongside rainwater and animal remains, winding its way to the River Thames, which Londoners conveniently used for drinking, bathing, washing clothes, and occasionally disposing of bodies. If you were thirsty, you fetched a bucket of Thames water. If you were unlucky, you fetched cholera's grandparent. It's safe to say that in Tudor London, you didn't so much hydrate as gamble. The smell was a national crisis. Visitors from abroad wrote in horror of the stench, describing the city as an olfactory battlefield. Fish markets reeked of decay, butchers dumped blood and guts into the street, and tanners, those lovely folks who turned animal hides into leather, boiled them in urine. The air itself seemed to have texture. The poor could not escape it, and even the rich perched in their grand homes found that the scent of their wealth was frequently drowned out by the perfume of decomposition wafting from the next alley. And then there was the population problem. The Tudor era saw London's numbers explode from roughly 50,000 in 1500 to more than 200,000 by the early 1600s. People poured in from the countryside seeking work, freedom, or at least something that didn't moo. Unfortunately, the city wasn't built to handle them. Houses leaned into each other like exhausted drunks, and ventilation was a luxury item. Privacy was non-existent, and personal hygiene was a myth. Bathing was rare, not because people didn't like it, but because the idea of soaking in water that looked like soup wasn't appealing. The cleanest thing in your home was probably the air coming through the holes in your roof. Add to this the Tudor belief that bad smells themselves caused illness, what they called miasma, and you have a city in full medieval irony. People genuinely thought that as long as you masked the stench, you'd be fine. So they burned incense, wore sweet-smelling herbs around their necks, or stuffed posies in their sleeves. Londoners walked around like terrified air fresheners. The wealthy even lined their homes with fragrant flowers and spices, thinking they were fighting disease when really they were just seasoning it. Noise didn't help either. The city was never quiet. Blacksmiths hammered metal from dawn till dusk. Market sellers shouted about their questionable produce, and stray dogs barked at everything that moved. Even the river had a voice, sloshing, bubbling, and occasionally burping up something unspeakable. At night, the city didn't rest. It coughed, wheezed, and snored in unison. Fires burned for warmth and light, filling the streets with thick, choking smoke. London wasn't just alive, it was wheezing for its life. And yet somehow, people thrived. They fell in love, raised children, started businesses, and wrote plays that would outlast the diseases that stalked their streets. This grimy, glorious chaos gave us Shakespeare, exploration, and the first real sense of what a modern city could be, complete with rats, death, and optimism. Living in Tudor London was like signing up for a reality show called Survivor Renaissance Edition. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the fleas. But despite the constant risk, Londoners kept going. They believed that sickness came from bad air, sin, or perhaps just bad luck, but never from each other. Crowds gathered in taverns, churches and playhouses, spreading laughter, gossip and, quite efficiently, bacteria. There was no social distancing in Tudor London, unless you counted the distance between you and your next bath. By the end of the 16th century, Tudor London had earned its reputation: vibrant, filthy, alive, and perpetually dying. It was the perfect breeding ground for plague, fever, and despair, yet also for resilience and reinvention. To live there was to accept that disease was part of the background noise, like church bells or shouting fishmongers. It was a place where death was a constant dinner guest, but no one ever stopped setting the table. Before the famous Victorian Great Stink of 1858, London already had centuries of practice in the fine art of smelling awful. The Tudors, in all their royal glory and ruffled collars, lived in a city where waste management was less a public service and more a shared misunderstanding. To put it politely, Tudor London didn't so much dispose of its waste as relocate it a few feet away and hope for the best. Picture this. It's early morning, the city is waking up, and suddenly, from a second-story window, someone shouts, "Gardez dehors," the traditional warning before tossing the contents of a chamber pot into the street. If you were unlucky enough to be passing by, you learned two lessons: always carry an umbrella and never look up in London. It was, quite literally, raining humanity. Chamber pots were emptied daily, sometimes multiple times a day, and the gutters ran with more than just rainwater. This fragrant river of waste flowed toward the Thames, the city's beloved waterway. The problem? The same river also provided drinking water. The Thames was both kitchen sink and sewer, baptismal font and biohazard. It was the Tudor version of multitasking, efficient, deadly and wildly unhygienic. If you wanted a refreshing drink, you just had to ignore the floating surprises. The smell alone could make a horse reconsider its career path. The streets themselves weren't much better. Tudor roads were narrow, uneven, and made of packed dirt or wooden planks, without proper drains. Every downpour turned the city into a slow-moving stew of mud, dung and refuse. The combination of horse manure, human waste, fish guts, and spoiled food created an aroma that could best be described as apocalyptic. Even the rats probably gagged. Walking anywhere required skill. Step wrong, and you might lose a shoe, your dignity, or both. Municipal cleaning efforts existed in theory, but rarely in practice. There were men called scavengers whose job was to remove waste from the streets, but their efficiency depended on bribes, weather, and mood. The city did appoint rakers to collect refuse and dump it outside the walls, but since that meant carting waste through the city, the solution often became part of the problem. Sometimes heaps of refuse simply piled up until they achieved historical landmark status. And then there were the cesspits. Beneath many Tudor homes were deep holes lined with brick or clay, designed to store household waste. A great idea on paper until they overflowed, which they did, frequently. The smell could leak through floors, walls and marriages. People hired gong farmers to empty these cesspits at night. These brave souls, part hero, part martyr, waded into the muck with buckets and ropes, removing the waste by hand and carting it off to be dumped somewhere marginally less populated. They were paid well, but the job was so revolting that even other Tudor workers pitied them, and that's saying something in a world where your local surgeon also shaved beards. The public latrines weren't much better. Communal toilets, known as jakes, were sometimes built over running water, but more often they were just holes that led nowhere in particular. They smelled like despair. If you were lucky, a thin partition separated you from your neighbour's existential crisis. In some cases, the floors gave way entirely, sending the unfortunate occupant on a rapid and aromatic descent into the pit below. Death by privy collapse was not unheard of. Imagine explaining that one to St. Peter. The Tudor obsession with hierarchy extended even to filth. The wealthy had servants to carry out their waste, and perfumed herbs to disguise the odour. The poor, however, had to live shoulder to shoulder with their refuse. In slums, human and animal waste mingled freely, and diseases like dysentery, typhoid and cholera thrived. The streets were alive, literally, with bacteria, flies, and the faint hope that tomorrow might smell slightly less awful. And yet, the Tudors didn't necessarily see this as a problem. They genuinely believed that foul odours themselves caused illness, the miasma theory again, but thought the solution was not to remove waste, but to overpower the stench. So instead of cleaning up, they burned aromatic woods, herbs and incense, which only added smoky toilet to the city's fragrance portfolio. Wealthy homes were filled with flowers, scented candles, and occasionally bowls of vinegar placed in corners to purify the air. It was the early modern version of a Glade plug-in, except the plug was a candle, and the outcome was more fire hazard than freshness. The link between waste and disease remained invisible. No one could see germs, but they could see the street muck, and they simply assumed it was part of urban life. After all, this was a city that took pride in its bustling energy. Londoners believed that a little filth was a sign of prosperity. More people meant more trade, and more trade meant more waste. In a twisted sense, the stench of Tudor London was proof that the economy was booming, and yet, behind every overflowing gutter and bursting cesspit, death quietly brewed. Waterborne diseases flourished. The same Thames water used to mix dough for bread was often the same water that had washed corpses downstream. Epidemics followed predictably, cutting through the population like a recurring subscription nobody wanted, but everyone got. The city was a living organism constantly poisoning itself and still managing to thrive. By the late Tudor period, attempts at improvement began, timid ones. Ordinances were passed urging citizens to keep streets clean and to avoid dumping refuse directly into the river. Predictably, most ignored them. After all, what was a little sewage between neighbours? In the end, Tudor London's greatest enemy wasn't just its diseases, but its denial. The people believed they could outsniff their problems, but every gust of wind from the Thames carried a warning and an aroma that progress without sanitation is just perfume on decay. If you were living in Tudor London and suddenly heard a neighbour sneeze, you didn't say bless you. You said your goodbyes. Because in this city, a sneeze wasn't a cold, it was a countdown. The Bubonic Plague had a way of reminding Londoners that the real landlords of the city weren't kings or queens. They were rats, fleas and bacteria, all working together like the world's worst business partnership. The plague wasn't new by Tudor times. It had already wiped out half of Europe 2 centuries earlier during the Black Death. But the disease didn't pack up and leave after that catastrophic visit. It stuck around like an uninvited houseguest. It flared up again and again, especially during the 1500s and early 1600s, turning London into a recurring horror story. The 16th century outbreaks didn't always make headlines like the Great Plague of 1665, but they were every bit as terrifying and far smellier. It all started with the rats. The city was a rodent paradise, overflowing refuse, dark alleys, and endless crumbs from crowded taverns. These weren't cute cartoon rats with dreams of becoming chefs. They were thick-furred, yellow-toothed survivalists who lived better than most peasants. They slipped through cracks in timber walls, nested in haylofts, and dined on whatever London dropped. But the true menace wasn't the rats themselves, it was what they carried. Enter the fleas. These microscopic monsters were the Uber drivers of death, ferrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the plague, from one warm-blooded victim to another. A flea would bite an infected rat, get a belly full of bacteria, and then when that rat inevitably died, hop over to the nearest human leg looking for a new meal. That's right, your ankle was basically the disease's front door. Once the bacteria entered your bloodstream, the clock started ticking. The plague didn't waste time. Within a few days, victims developed a fever so fierce they could barely move. Pain followed, deep, wrenching pain, and then the buboes appeared. Swollen, black lumps in the groin, armpits and neck. These grotesque swellings were filled with pus and despair. Some sufferers tried to lance them open, which, shockingly, did not help. The stench was so foul that entire households could be identified by smell alone. Even doctors hesitated to enter plague houses, which, given their treatment methods, might have been the most medically responsible choice they ever made. And the speed. Oh, the speed! In some outbreaks, people died within 24 hours of showing symptoms. Imagine it. One day you're buying bread. The next day the bread's outliving you. Families vanished within a week. Streets fell silent except for the creak of cartwheels carrying the dead. There was no warning, no mercy, and absolutely no understanding of what was happening. The concept of germs was centuries away, so Londoners blamed everything else. Bad air, angry stars, divine punishment, even foreigners. The only thing they didn't blame was the army of rats literally running the show. When plague hit, panic followed. Whole neighbourhoods were sealed off, sometimes too late, sometimes too cruelly. Watchmen were stationed at doors to prevent the infected from escaping, which meant many people died locked inside their homes. Bring Out Your Dead wasn't just a Monty Python joke, it was the daily soundtrack of London life. Corpses piled up faster than gravediggers could bury them. Plague pits were dug in churchyards and fields, vast holes where hundreds of bodies were thrown together and covered in lime. The city's underbelly became one enormous expanding cemetery. Commerce collapsed, theatres closed, and even royal courts fled to the countryside at the first rumour of plague. Henry VIII, for example, was notorious for running from London whenever disease broke out. He'd pack up his entire household and retreat to a cleaner, less plaguey location, usually a palace conveniently upwind. This royal strategy worked fine for kings, but not so well for the average fishmonger who couldn't exactly telecommute. Doctors, meanwhile, became both a symbol of hope and horror. Dressed in long black coats, gloves, and those iconic bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, they looked like goth pigeons attending a masquerade. The beak wasn't just for fashion, it was supposed to filter out the miasma, or bad air, believed to cause plague. Ironically, the costume may have actually worked a little, since the layers offered some accidental protection from fleas. So yes, the first hazmat suit in history was basically a bird costume, but even the most determined doctors couldn't stop it. The plague didn't care about status or skill. It treated nobles, beggars, and clergy alike. It found you whether you lived in a damp alley or behind palace gates. And because Londoners kept dumping waste into the streets and drinking from the same river they defiled, the cycle never truly ended. Every generation grew up fearing the sound of a neighbour's cough. Some priests and chroniclers of the time described the plague as a divine broom sweeping away sin. Others saw it as Satan's work. But for most Londoners, it was simply life. You lived with death in your shadow. You hoped your family wasn't next, and you prayed to whatever saint handled last-minute miracles. Fear became normal. Even laughter, dark, nervous laughter, was a way to cope. After all, in Tudor London, if you didn't laugh at the absurdity of it all, you'd cry into your contaminated ale. And yet, London endured. The survivors buried their dead, scrubbed their walls with vinegar, and reopened their markets. They rebuilt again and again, each time believing the worst was behind them. They were wrong, of course, but they didn't know that. Hope, it turns out, was the one thing the plague couldn't kill. By the time the Tudors ruled England, the Black Death was supposed to be history, a terrifying medieval memory best left in dusty chronicles. But London, being London, never got the memo. The plague didn't vanish after the 14th century. It simply learned how to blend in. It crept through Tudor alleyways, hid in barrels of grain, and lurked beneath the laughter of markets and taverns. The truth was simple and grim. The Black Death never left. It just kept changing costumes. If the city had a motto, it might as well have been, "Keep calm and bury everyone." In 1485, the very year Henry VII seized the throne, England was greeted by a new disease that felt suspiciously familiar, the sweating sickness. But even as that mystery took hold, the old plague was quietly staging its comeback. By 1499, London experienced a fresh wave of bubonic horror. It swept through the capital like a scythe, claiming thousands. Imagine starting a new dynasty, only for your first official royal event to be an epidemic. The Tudor throne was barely warm before rats reclaimed their crown. Each outbreak hit differently, but they all followed the same grim choreography. The first sign was silence. The city seemed to hold its breath. Then came the bells, tolling endlessly as bodies began piling up faster than carts could carry them. Fear travelled faster than the disease itself. People packed up their belongings and fled for the countryside, turning inns and farms into makeshift quarantine zones. Those who stayed in London barricaded themselves indoors, hoping the pestilence would pass by like an unwanted guest. It rarely did. The 1510s and 1520s brought repeated flare-ups. Henry VIII, whose love life could fill its own tragedy, was also a serial plague dodger. Whenever an outbreak began, he evacuated London with royal precision, dragging courtiers and servants behind him like an anxious parade. The court moved from palace to palace, chasing fresh air and leaving abandoned banquet tables in its wake. Royal correspondence from the time reads like a travel-log of panic. The plague has come to London. His Majesty rides for Windsor. Meanwhile, the citizens left behind had no such luxury. Their lives became an unending cycle of hope, dread and funerals. City officials tried to impose rules, plague houses were marked with red crosses, gatherings were banned, and searchers were appointed to identify plague victims. But enforcement was chaotic. Searchers were often poor women paid a few pennies to inspect corpses, which meant touching infected bodies daily without any protection. Their bravery and probable ignorance of germs kept records alive, but also shortened their own lives dramatically. By 1535, another major wave swept through London. Parish registers overflowed with death entries. Entire families disappeared between one Sunday and the next. Shops closed, theatres went dark, and public executions, the Tudor equivalent of Netflix, were postponed. When your society stops killing people for entertainment, you know things are serious. Even beggars, usually fearless in their search for coins, avoided touching others. The streets emptied, and the few who ventured out carried pomanders, small perforated balls filled with herbs to protect against the bad air. The city looked less like a capital, and more like a stage set for tragedy, complete with actors too terrified to perform. Doctors continued to blame the heavens. Astrological charts were drawn to determine the plague's cause. Maybe the planets were misaligned. Maybe it was God's wrath for sins involving ale, gossip, or both. Physicians prescribed everything from vinegar baths to crushed emeralds, which did nothing but make poverty look like a cure. Some recommended avoiding sadness, as if cheerfulness could frighten off the bacteria. Laugh, and you shall not perish, they said. It was, to put it mildly, a flawed treatment plan. But perhaps the most haunting part of these recurring outbreaks was how normal they became. Plague wasn't a once-in-a-lifetime event. It was a recurring feature of existence. Every few years, Londoners braced themselves for another round. Children grew up with plague as part of their vocabulary, like weather or gossip. Weddings were delayed, businesses halted, and families developed the eerie skill of recognizing early symptoms. In a way, the Tudor mind learned to live with death as an everyday companion. And yet, out of this chaos, some remarkable resilience emerged. Londoners adapted. City officials began keeping death bills, weekly lists of plague victims, which later evolved into the early bills of mortality. These records were grim but groundbreaking. For the first time, the city tracked its own suffering with data. It wasn't modern medicine, but it was the beginning of public health awareness, an accidental victory born from desperation. Of course, not all solutions were practical. Some well-meaning citizens tried fumigating their homes with burning pitch and sulphur. Others wore beaked masks filled with herbs, a fashion statement that screamed both terrified and mildly flammable. Quack doctors sold miracle cures like plague water, angel ointment and unicorn horn powder. The latter, tragically, was actually powdered narwhal tusk. Nothing says human progress like drinking sea mammal dust while dying of infection. Still, through every outbreak, London rose again. The population would shrink, mourn, rebuild, and pretend to have learned lessons. Then, a few years later, someone would sneeze, and it all began again. The cycle continued deep into Elizabeth I's reign. Even the Queen herself took precautions. She banned public gatherings during plague time and ordered that all household linens of the infected be burned. It was one of the few Tudor policies that actually worked, at least temporarily. But by the end of the 16th century, one thing was clear. Plague was no longer an invader. It was a citizen. It had lived in London for so long it practically paid taxes, if death ever paid taxes. It shaped the way people built their homes, conducted business, and even worshipped. The fear of contagion left fingerprints on the city's architecture and soul alike. And yet, life never stopped. People still laughed, traded, and married in between outbreaks. Plays were written, songs were sung, and markets reopened the moment the bells stopped tolling. Hope, absurdly, always found a way to survive. The Black Death never left, but neither did Londoners. If Tudor London had a list of worst fears, the plague sat at the top. But right beneath it was something even stranger, faster, and more baffling, the sweating sickness. It came suddenly, without warning, and vanished just as mysteriously. Physicians couldn't explain it, the church couldn't pray it away, and common sense didn't stand a chance. It was the only Tudor trend no one wanted to catch, but everyone did. The first major outbreak struck England in 1485, right as Henry VII marched to the throne. Some said the new king brought it with him from the battlefield at Bosworth, an ominous coronation gift. Others whispered that it was divine punishment for too much ambition, or perhaps a sinister royal curse. Whatever its origin, it hit London like divine lightning fast, fatal and frighteningly selective. Within days, people who seemed perfectly healthy were collapsing in the streets. The disease's symptoms were both simple and terrifying. Symptoms began with chills and an overwhelming sense of dread. Tudors didn't need WebMD to know something was wrong. Then came the sweat. Profuse, unstoppable, body-soaking sweat that drenched clothing and bedsheets alike. Victims burned with fever, their hearts raced, and within hours most were dead. Some reports claimed the sickness could kill in less than a day. You could go from morning errands to eternal rest before supper. It was the fast food of death. What made the English sweat particularly horrifying was how unpredictable it was. Unlike the plague, it didn't always strike the poor first. It went straight for the wealthy, the noble, and the fashionable. Servants and labourers still died, of course, but the aristocracy suffered the most dramatic losses. For once, disease ignored social rank. That alone was enough to terrify the upper class. After all, what good was gold if your biggest enemy was your own body temperature? And London, being London, turned chaos into routine. People fled the city in droves, abandoning their shops, homes, and sometimes even their families. The royal court evacuated every time rumours began to spread. Henry VII, never one to take chances, kept moving between palaces, each more isolated than the last. His son, the future Henry VIII, inherited the same paranoia. Whenever the Hot Death, as it was sometimes called, reappeared, Henry shut down London's government and retreated to the countryside, dragging courtiers and cooks alike. Imagine the royal itinerary, 1 part monarchy, 1 part marathon. Even more unsettling was how the disease refused to follow predictable cycles. After the first outbreak in 1485, it re-emerged several times 1508, 1517, 1528, and finally in 1551. The 1528 epidemic was especially brutal, sweeping through London like wildfire. In some parishes, half the population perished in a matter of weeks. The court tried to flee, but the sickness outran them. Ambassadors, bishops, and merchants all died within days of one another. The French ambassador even sent reports home describing it as the most sudden and fatal malady imaginable, which, coming from a country familiar with guillotines, was saying something. And then, as mysteriously as it appeared, it would vanish. No lingering contagion, no predictable aftershocks, just sudden silence. People whispered theories. Was it caused by bad food, contaminated air, evil spirits, a cosmic joke? The medical community, which at the time still thought bleeding cured everything, had no clue. Doctors prescribed rest, vinegar baths and prayers, which cured about as many people as ignoring it. Modern historians have tried to solve the mystery, but even today no one can say for sure what caused it. Some suspect hantavirus spread by rodents, because apparently rats hadn't done enough damage. Others point to a form of influenza or a rare bacterial infection. A few even suggest it was a unique, now extinct virus. Whatever it was, it terrified Europe so much that when it finally disappeared after the 1551 outbreak, people didn't celebrate. They waited in silence, listening for the sound of its return. Unlike the plague, which left visible signs like buboes and boils, the sweating sickness left no mark, just corpses that looked as though they'd run a marathon in their sleep. There were no rashes, no sores, no grotesque disfigurements. Victims simply overheated, sweated through everything they owned, and died exhausted. It was as if the disease burned its victims from the inside out. Some chroniclers even noted that people died smiling, though that was probably less bliss and more rigor mortis. The suddenness of the illness gave rise to wild superstitions. People believed it struck those who had recently indulged in sinful behaviour, dancing, drinking, or, God forbid, enjoying themselves. Others blamed the stars, claiming the alignment of planets had cooked the air. It was said that even mentioning the disease aloud could summon it, so Londoners began whispering euphemisms like the heat or the visitation. If gossip were contagious, the sweat would have lasted forever. The social impact was enormous. Trade halted, markets closed, and even churches shut their doors. Funerals became assembly line operations, with gravediggers working around the clock. In many parishes, there weren't enough living to bury the dead. Fear ruled the streets. Doors were bolted, windows boarded up, and the sound of coughing could empty a room faster than fire. It was the ultimate Tudor lockdown, minus the hygiene, and with significantly more screaming. And yet, as always, London endured. When the final major outbreak hit in 1551, the city responded with weary efficiency. Physicians recorded symptoms with a detached curiosity, priests carried on last rites, and survivors simply waited. Then, suddenly, it was over. The English sweat vanished as mysteriously as it began, never to return. It was as if death itself had grown bored and moved on. The absence of a clear cause turned it into legend. Even centuries later, Victorians still whispered about the sweat of the Tudors. Some imagined it was divine punishment for the Wars of the Roses. Others thought it an early bioweapon because who doesn't love a conspiracy? Whatever it was, it left behind a haunting legacy. A reminder that even in an age obsessed with cleanliness of the soul, the body could betray you in the blink of an eye. In a city already drowning in filth, the sweating sickness proved that not all killers were visible. The Tudors could blame bad air, rats, or even witchcraft, but sometimes the real terror came from within. If Tudor London had a beauty problem, it wasn't bad makeup or bad lighting, it was smallpox. The disease didn't just steal lives, it stole faces. It was a cruel artist that left its signature everywhere. Deep scars, clouded eyes, and a generation of people who looked as if they'd wrestled with fire and lost. You didn't need beauty standards when half the population had matching pockmarks. Smallpox was an equal opportunity destroyer. It didn't care if you wore silk or rags, gold rings or calloused hands. Nobles and peasants alike found themselves at its mercy, which was precisely none. The disease likely arrived in England centuries earlier, but during the Tudor era, it reached epidemic levels, spreading through London's narrow streets, crowded markets, and unsanitary homes with terrifying ease. It didn't take a genius to catch it, just a handshake, a shared goblet, or the misfortune of breathing in the wrong direction. Once it entered your body, smallpox was patient, but not merciful. The incubation period lasted a week or two, giving victims false hope that maybe, just maybe, that headache wasn't anything serious. But then the fever hit. Not the kind of fever you could sleep off, but the kind that made you sweat through your sheets and question your life choices. Muscles ached, bones burned, and then came the rash. Small red spots that quickly turned into raised blisters filled with pus. Each one was a tiny declaration of war against your skin. Within days, your body became a battlefield, and the enemy was winning. The most horrifying part wasn't just the agony, it was the aftermath. Those who survived often carried lifelong reminders in the form of cratered scars. Faces, once smooth and unremarkable, became maps of suffering. Blindness was common too. If the virus reached your eyes, it left them clouded like frosted glass. For a society obsessed with appearances, this was devastating. In an age before concealer and Photoshop, your complexion was your resume. Smallpox didn't just take lives, it tanked social prospects. Even the royals weren't spared. Nobles might have had silk sheets and perfumed rooms, but the virus was unimpressed by class. Henry VIII himself suffered repeated bouts of illness during his reign, and while historians debate whether it was truly smallpox, his court certainly knew the disease well. Courtiers dropped dead, heirs vanished, and portraits had to work extra hard to flatter their subjects. But sit for a painting and pray the artist had a generous imagination. The Tudor obsession with divine punishment only made things worse. Many believed smallpox was a heavenly message about sin, or perhaps vanity itself. Priests preached that the spots were God's way of humbling the proud, while others argued that it was simply the devil taking his turn. People prayed, confessed, burned incense, and tried anything to earn divine forgiveness. The irony, of course, was that most outbreaks began in overcrowded churches during services of repentance. You came to beg God for protection, and left with a contagious rash. Medical treatments were a nightmare of creativity and futility. Physicians prescribed everything from bloodletting to bathing in milk. One popular remedy involved wrapping the patient in red cloth, because as one Tudor doctor claimed, red draws out the humours. If only viruses respected colour theory. Others recommended opening the pustules to let the poison escape, which only spread the infection further. Apothecaries sold potions made from crushed emeralds, vinegar, and ground pearls, the kind of recipe that would bankrupt you and kill you. But perhaps the cruelest part was how easily smallpox spread among children. Tudor London was full of them, dirty, loud, and impossible to quarantine. One infected child could take down an entire household. Families would watch helplessly as feverish children screamed and convulsed, their faces erupting in blisters. And when they recovered, if they recovered, they bore the scars forever. There's a reason portraits of Elizabethan children rarely show smiles. Between bad dentistry and smallpox, no one was photogenic. For women, the disease carried an extra layer of horror. In a world where marriage was survival, appearance mattered. A pockmarked face could destroy a noblewoman's prospects faster than gossip. Some wore thick layers of white lead makeup to hide their scars, a cosmetic choice that slowly poisoned them. The Tudors really couldn't catch a break. If smallpox didn't kill you, your face cream would. The disease was also a silent political force. Succession lines were disrupted when heirs died suddenly. Marriages between royal houses were postponed or cancelled after outbreaks. The constant threat of smallpox created an atmosphere of unease. Even the glittering Tudor court with its feasts and festivities lived under its shadow. Every royal procession, every banquet, could end with someone coughing blood into their sleeve. And yet, as deadly as it was, smallpox didn't always bring panic. It brought weary acceptance. Londoners grew used to the sight of survivors with scarred faces. In some strange way, it became a badge of endurance, proof that you'd faced death and won. Marked by the pox wasn't flattering, but it was almost respectable. Better to be scarred than buried. Still, the city tried to fight back in its own desperate ways. When rumours spread of infection, houses were marked, and infected individuals were often confined. Clean linens were burned, vinegar was splashed on walls, and prayers filled the air. The cures might not have worked, but they gave people a sense of control, a fragile illusion that they weren't helpless against an invisible enemy. Smallpox wouldn't be conquered until centuries later, when vaccination finally arrived. But in the Tudor world, it remained an unavoidable curse, a cruel reminder that even in an age of ambition and empire, nature still ruled the throne. Behind every royal portrait and every peasant's grave was the quiet legacy of the spotted terror, reshaping faces, families, and fate itself. There are few diseases in history that managed to kill with such elegance as tuberculosis. Known in Tudor England as consumption, it was a slow, poetic sort of death, the kind that didn't just end lives but inspired art, pity, and somehow fashion trends. The pale cheeks, the delicate cough, the distant, dreamy eyes. It was the Elizabethan equivalent of a melancholic Instagram filter. Who needs blush when tuberculosis gives you that natural dying glow? Consumption earned its name from the way it consumed the body over time. Victims wasted away, losing weight until they looked more spectre than human. Their skin turned translucent, their lips flushed faintly pink, and their eyes grew unnervingly bright, like candles burning out. In an age that worshipped fair skin and poetic suffering, tuberculosis was practically an aesthetic. Sure, it was fatal, but you'd look ethereal doing it. The disease itself was far from graceful. Caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, it attacked the lungs, filling them with blood and fluid. Victims coughed constantly, soft at first, then with the rasping insistence of a saw through wood. The coughing fits could last hours, and they often produced blood-streaked phlegm. Rooms echoed with the sound of lungs betraying their owners. Nights were sleepless, days were fevered, and every breath felt like a negotiation. But in the Tudor world, where medicine was still a mix of prayer, guesswork, and the occasional pigeon poultice, tuberculosis was viewed less as a disease and more as a temperament. People didn't say you were sick, they said you were delicate. Young women who displayed the signature pallor and frailty were thought to possess spiritual purity. In art and poetry, consumption was romanticized, the ultimate symbol of tragic beauty. Dying beautifully, it seemed, was an acceptable substitute for living well. And of course, London was the perfect incubator. The city's damp climate, smoke-choked air, and overcrowded housing created ideal conditions for spreading infection. Families huddled together in one-room homes, sharing air, beds, and bacteria. Poor nutrition didn't help. Malnourished bodies had little defense against an airborne disease. The rich fared no better indoors, living in grand but poorly ventilated mansions where tapestries trapped dust and windows were kept closed to preserve warmth and privacy. It was a grand experiment in how to suffocate fashionably. One of the cruelest tricks of tuberculosis was its pace. Unlike plague or smallpox, which announced themselves with terrifying speed, consumption took its time. It crept quietly, seducing its victims into false optimism. A patient might go weeks or months feeling just a bit off, until suddenly they were too weak to climb stairs or speak without gasping. Death didn't come in a rush. It arrived in whispers, over tea, in the middle of a poem, or mid-sermon. Families could watch the same person fade for years, like a candle burning lower each night. Tudor doctors, of course, had no idea what caused it. The concept of bacteria was centuries away, so they blamed everything from bad air to unbalanced humours. One common theory claimed that melancholy or overthinking could make you sick. The cure? Less thinking. Others recommended bloodletting, milk baths, or breathing exercises in the countryside. The latter at least worked by accident, since clean air was one thing London definitely lacked. Still, most victims were prescribed herbal syrups, honey infusions, or wine, a treatment that conveniently made everyone feel better about dying. Some physicians even believed tuberculosis was contagious through sight. Yes, sight. The idea was that the vapours of sickness could be transmitted if you looked too long at a patient's pale face. This led to an unspoken etiquette: admire the consumptive beauty, but don't stare. It was the Renaissance version of social distancing, minus the science. Despite the horror, the disease held an odd cultural power. Literature, songs and plays of the Tudor age were filled with swooning heroines coughing into lace handkerchiefs, their fragility mistaken for virtue. The poetic imagination loved a good death scene, and consumption provided exactly that: long, dramatic and heartbreakingly picturesque. If you were a playwright and needed a noble exit, consumption was your go-to. The audience cried, the actors coughed beautifully, everyone went home satisfied and slightly afraid. But not everyone found the disease romantic. For the poor, it was simply another sentence in a life already full of misery. Tuberculosis stalked workhouses, taverns and tenements. The constant coughing in these places wasn't poetry, it was background noise. Many Londoners grew up recognizing the sound of death before they could spell their own names. Children were particularly vulnerable. Many died before reaching adulthood, their graves marked with little more than initials. Families were left with grief, debt, and the faint hope that they might not be next. Even the upper class couldn't escape. Tudor monarchs and nobles were no strangers to lingering illness, though they often cloaked it under euphemisms like a wasting sickness. It was more fashionable to say you were suffering from consumption of the chest than to admit your lungs were liquefying. To be sick with style was somehow better than being healthy with mediocrity. And so tuberculosis became both a tragedy and a trend. Its victims inspired paintings, sonnets and elegies, all drenched in sentimentality. The disease blurred the line between beauty and decay until people began to see sickness itself as refinement. Looking pale wasn't a sign of illness, it was chic. Rosy cheeks meant you were probably working too hard, and heaven forbid you looked hearty. The sicker you looked, the higher your chances of being called sensitive. Of course, no amount of romanticism changed the ending. Consumption was a slow executioner, and it always finished what it started. It hollowed out London's lungs one breath at a time, leaving behind echoes of coughs and elegies. For the Tudors, tuberculosis wasn't just a disease, it was a mirror of their age. Beautiful, doomed, and full of denial. If the plague terrified Tudor London and tuberculosis romanticised it, syphilis absolutely scandalised it. It was the uninvited guest at the royal court, the whispered word in taverns, and the disease that came with more drama than a Shakespearean love triangle. No other illness could ruin your looks, reputation and sanity in such spectacular fashion. And as for the cure, doctors treated it with poison, because why stop at one problem when you can have two? Syphilis first arrived in Europe at the end of the 15th century, just as explorers were busily discovering the New World. Many historians believe returning sailors brought it back as an unpleasant souvenir, making it the world's most notorious import. The disease spread across Europe faster than gossip in a Tudor court, reaching England by the early 1500s. And London, crowded, passionate, and absolutely terrible at hygiene, was the perfect host. The Tudors, however, didn't call it syphilis. They preferred more dramatic names: the French disease, the Great Pox, or simply the foul evil. Naturally, the French blamed the Italians blamed the Spanish, and the English blamed everyone who wasn't English. This was the only international cooperation Europe could manage at the time. Collective denial. At first, no one knew what they were dealing with. The symptoms were as unpredictable as Tudor politics. It began with sores, small, painless bumps that appeared on, well, personal regions. Most victims ignored them because embarrassment was stronger than self-preservation. But as the disease advanced, it transformed into a grotesque horror show. Ulcers, rashes, and bone-deep pain that made even strong men weep. In later stages, the face began to collapse as cartilage dissolved, leaving victims with disfigured noses and hollow eyes. There's a reason portraits from the era feature so many people holding fans or flowers. They were probably covering something up. The worst part was that syphilis took its time. It could lie dormant for years, silently destroying the body from within. Victims went mad, developed tremors, and often died slowly and humiliatingly. Yet despite the clear evidence that it was contagious, people refused to stop doing the one thing spreading it: sleeping with each other. The Tudor solution to a deadly sexually transmitted disease was, essentially, don't ask, don't tell. The royal court was no exception. Gossip suggested that courtiers, soldiers, and even clergy caught the disease in shocking numbers. London's brothels, officially tolerated and unofficially thriving, became breeding grounds for infection. The same city that outlawed swearing still let you rent a bed by the hour. Physicians, ever the optimists, described the disease as a sickness of love, which sounds poetic until you realise it meant you're rotting from romance. Then came the treatments, because the Tudors, bless them, always had a cure that was worse than the illness. The most popular remedy was mercury. Doctors believed rubbing it into the skin, swallowing it, or even inhaling it, could purge the body of venereal poison. Patients were smeared head to toe in mercury ointment, wrapped in blankets, and left to sweat profusely. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, became the grim saying of the day. And while the treatment did occasionally kill the bacteria, it also killed quite a few patients. Mercury poisoning caused teeth to fall out, hair to thin, and tongues to swell. You might survive syphilis, but you'd be bald, drooling, and partially liquefied. Another delightful option was fumigation. The patient was placed in a closed wooden box with only their head sticking out, and trays of burning mercury or sulfur were placed inside. The idea was that the vapor would cleanse the body. The reality? It turned your lungs into an alchemical experiment. Some treatments even involved drinking concoctions containing arsenic, because apparently the only thing worse than dying of syphilis was dying creatively. For the wealthy, physicians recommended long retreats to mineral baths or healthy air resorts, where nobles could cough elegantly into their lace sleeves while pretending to be cured. For the poor, there were herbal poultices, wine-based tonics, and hope, mostly hope. Prostitutes were blamed, of course, and many were imprisoned or publicly shamed, but syphilis didn't care about morality. It struck saints, sinners, and everyone in between. The disease was the great Tudor equalizer, if a terrible one. Religious leaders, as usual, saw divine retribution at work. Pamphlets declared the disease punishment for lust and sin. Sermons thundered about the wages of fornication, and artists painted terrifying allegories of decaying bodies. Yet the same moralists quietly ignored that many noblemen were among the afflicted. If sin truly caused syphilis, then half the aristocracy was damned. Despite its horror, syphilis had an unexpected cultural impact. It became a grim fascination in art and medicine. Surgeons began recording its stages in anatomical drawings, creating some of the first medical illustrations in English history. Apothecaries invented new ointments and elixirs, giving birth to the modern pharmaceutical trade. Even playwrights took inspiration. References to the pox appeared in bawdy comedies and tragedies alike. It was the disease that dared not speak its name, but everyone was talking about it anyway. Over time, people learned to hide their symptoms behind fashion. Heavy face powders, scented gloves, and ornate masks became all the rage among those hoping to conceal lesions and sores. Perfume wasn't just for beauty, it was camouflage. The courts smelled like roses, lavender, and mild panic. If someone fainted from mercury fumes, you simply opened a window and pretended it was the corset. By the late Tudor period, syphilis had become a permanent resident of London life, a quiet spectre haunting boudoirs and bathhouses. Its victims might have been pitied, mocked or condemned, but they were never forgotten. The disease outlasted monarchs and marriages, shaping the history of medicine and morality alike. In the end, syphilis was the perfect Tudor metaphor, seductive, secretive, and spectacularly self-destructive. It blurred the line between sin and science, between desire and death, and for centuries to come, its legacy would remain, a painful reminder that sometimes the deadliest gifts come wrapped in passion. If you lived in Tudor London and managed to dodge the plague, tuberculosis, smallpox, and the romantic misfortunes of syphilis, congratulations, you are now eligible for typhus. Known at the time as jail fever or gull fever, this disease was the city's most democratic punishment. You didn't need to commit a crime to catch prison fever, just live near someone who had. In a city overflowing with people and filth, that meant nearly everyone was on trial. Typhus wasn't a single dramatic epidemic like the plague, it was a constant background presence, a slow-burning infection that followed wherever humans, lice and poor hygiene gathered. It was caused by Rickettsia prowazekii, a microscopic parasite transmitted by the human body, louse. But of course, the Tudors didn't know that. To them, lice were an unfortunate fact of life, not biological assassins. Everyone had them, the poor, the rich, even royalty. Picking them off was practically a social activity. People might chat, gossip, or negotiate marriages while casually scratching their scalps. Little did they know their tiny companions were carrying one of the deadliest diseases of the era. The perfect breeding ground for typhus? Prisons. Tudor jails were less like correctional institutions and more like medieval compost heaps. Overcrowded, dark, and airless, they overflowed with filth and despair. Prisoners slept shoulder to shoulder on straw that hadn't been changed since the last plague. Food was scarce, water was foul, and lice were the only residents who didn't complain. The disease spread quickly in these tight quarters, leaving guards, inmates, and even visiting magistrates gasping for air within days. One of the most notorious outbreaks occurred during the mid-16th century, when several English court sessions were held in confined spaces packed with prisoners awaiting trial. The result? The prisoners infected the judges, lawyers, and spectators, essentially everyone who came to administer justice. Whole courtrooms fell sick within days. In 1577, during the assize sessions at Oxford, gall fever killed the Lord Chief Baron, 2 knights, and nearly 300 others. Justice was served, but so was death. And typhus didn't stay politely behind bars. Once it escaped the prisons, it found new homes in ships, workhouses, and city slums. Sailors and soldiers, always packed together in close quarters, carried it across seas and battlefields. When fleets returned to port, they brought more than trade goods. They brought outbreaks, ships that should have delivered profit instead, unloaded pestilence. London's docklands became incubators of infection, where dock workers, sailors, and merchants mingled in a haze of sweat, rot, and rumour. On land, things were no better. In the city's poorest neighbourhoods, entire families lived in single rooms, sharing not only beds but infestations. Bedding was rarely washed, and changing clothes often meant turning them inside out. These lice-infested garments carried the infection from house to house, turning entire streets into corridors of fever. In a place where sanitation meant don't look too closely, typhus thrived like an uninvited tenant who never left. The symptoms were unmistakable and unforgettable. Victims began with a sudden fever and chills, followed by splitting headaches, muscle pain, and a rash that spread from the torso outward. As the disease advanced, confusion and delirium set in. Sufferers babbled nonsense, shouted at invisible enemies, and sometimes became violent. It wasn't uncommon for the fevered to rip at their clothes, clawing at the invisible lice that had already done their damage. Those who survived described the disease as a waking nightmare. Those who didn't simply disappeared into the city's overflowing burial pits. And yet, because typhus moved slowly through communities rather than striking all at once, it rarely earned the same historical fame as the plague. It was the quiet killer, the one that slipped through courtrooms, barracks and tenements unnoticed until half the population was sick. In that sense, typhus was almost respectable, a disease that preferred subtlety over spectacle. The Tudor understanding of its cause, of course, was delightfully wrong. Physicians blamed corrupt air, evil vapours, or moral decay. One theory suggested that the disease came from the exhalations of the wicked, which was a very polite way of saying it's your fault for being poor. Remedies were predictable: bleeding, purging, and the ever-popular sweating treatment, which involved wrapping the patient in blankets until they either recovered or boiled. Some recommended fumigation with burning herbs, which at least had the benefit of masking the smell of despair. The royal court, aware that prisons were death traps, did everything possible to stay far, far away. Henry VIII and Elizabeth I both issued orders to improve jail conditions, but improvement usually meant building thicker walls to keep the disease inside. Of course, that didn't help much when half the court still mingled with infected servants, soldiers and sailors returning from campaigns. Typhus didn't need an invitation. It just needed a body with a pulse and a louse with bad manners. The disease also became a grim metaphor for social decay. Preachers used jail fever as a warning from God, claiming that moral corruption in the city's lower classes had infected the body politic. Ironically, the people most often dying of typhus were those who could least afford to be corrupt: the hungry, the cold, the imprisoned. But moral lessons were easier to preach than sanitation reforms. Despite the horror, there were glimmers of progress. Some Tudor officials began experimenting with fumigating prisons using vinegar and herbs, or even washing inmates, a radical idea at the time. These small steps hinted at an early understanding that disease might have something to do with cleanliness. It would take centuries before hygiene became law, but typhus planted the seed through sheer relentless misery. By the end of the Tudor period, typhus had become as much a part of London life as market cries and church bells. It was a disease born of neglect and sustained by poverty, a grim reminder that the walls meant to contain criminals also contained contagion. And while the Tudors didn't have microscopes or antibiotics, they did have one clear lesson. In London, you didn't have to be guilty to suffer punishment. Sometimes, merely being alive was crime enough. If plague was swift, smallpox was scarring, and typhus was sneaky, dysentery was simply undignified. Known in Tudor London as the bloody flux, it was the disease that reminded everyone from kings to beggars that nature didn't care about your social standing. Dysentery was democracy in its purest, messiest form. It didn't matter how fancy your robes were. Once it struck, all roads led to the same unfortunate destination. Dysentery, because even royalty deserves a humbling bathroom experience. At its core, dysentery was an infection of the intestines usually caused by contaminated food or water, two things Tudor England had in abundance. The city's drinking sources were a public health nightmare. The River Thames, that majestic artery of commerce, doubled as London's universal garbage bin. People drank from it, washed clothes in it, bathed in it, and used it as a convenient dumping ground for human waste and dead animals. It wasn't a river, it was soup. Every gulp was a gamble. The wealthy, of course, pretended to be above such dangers. They had servants fetch water from supposedly clean wells or distant springs. Unfortunately, those wells were often just as contaminated, thanks to cesspits leaking through the porous soil. There was no escaping the problem. Clean water was a fantasy, and the fantasy came with diarrhea. In cities and towns, dysentery thrived in public latrines, open pits of misery that made even the bravest souls hesitate. Many were built over shallow holes lined with wood, sometimes shared by dozens of people a day. The smell alone was a public warning. When these pits overflowed, as they frequently did, waste spilled into nearby streets, markets and water sources. And since Tudor street cleaners were both rare and disinterested, the result was a city where walking too fast could qualify as an athletic event and a health hazard. In the Tudor imagination, dysentery wasn't just a sickness, it was a curse. People called it the flux, the bloody flux, or, for the dramatic, the scourge of the belly. Symptoms were unmistakable: violent cramps, fever, and endless trips to the privy, often accompanied by blood. Bitty arms became weak and dehydrated, and death came not with a dramatic plague bell, but a slow, humiliating fade. You didn't get a noble death from dysentery. You just got very, very tired of sitting down. and nowhere did dysentery thrive more gleefully than in army camps. Tudor soldiers were experts at spreading it across entire continents. Marching through muddy fields, sleeping in ditches, and sharing unwashed rations was the perfect recipe for disaster. Clean water was rare, discipline was looser than a shoelace, and the camp latrines, if they existed, were dug far too close to cooking areas. The result? Armies that often lost more men to the privy than to the enemy. During Henry VIII's French campaigns, soldiers were decimated not by swords but by their own stomachs. Military chroniclers noted that fluxes and fevers did consume them grievously. Translation: they couldn't stop running to the bushes. Even hardened knights learned that bravery meant little when your intestines staged a rebellion. Dysentery didn't discriminate. It took kings, generals, and foot soldiers alike. For all Henry's ambitions of conquest, his armies were constantly outflanked by their bowels. And it wasn't just the battlefield. Ships, too, became floating laboratories of infection. Long voyages without fresh water turned every sip into a microbial lottery. Sailors stored water in wooden casks that quickly grew slimy and foul, and any attempt to boil it was a waste of precious fuel. The ocean might have been endless, but finding something safe to drink aboard was another matter entirely. Crews succumbed by the dozens, leaving ghost ships bobbing into harbour with more corpses than cargo. For the poor in London, dysentery was a recurring companion. During hot summers, when the stench of refuse grew unbearable, cases surged. Children, always the most vulnerable, often died within days. Hospitals overflowed, though most avoided them if they could. Early treatments were as questionable as the water itself. Physicians recommended purging, bleeding, or, worse, strengthening broths made from ingredients that were themselves teeming with bacteria. It was a culinary form of suicide. Some apothecaries offered powders and potions promising relief, often mixed with wine or vinegar. One popular remedy involved drinking a mixture of red wine and crushed coral, because nothing says medical progress like drinking beach rocks. Others swore by boiled herbs, mint infusions, or most tragically, mercury compounds. Mercury made yet another cameo as the Tudor cure-all, which only ensured that if dysentery didn't kill you, your medicine would. Among the upper classes, the situation wasn't much more elegant. Court physicians tried to treat noble victims with warm baths and expensive diets of white bread and chicken broth. Yet even royalty couldn't escape the indignity of dysentery's grip. Henry V had died of it a century earlier, and though Tudor chroniclers were too polite to write about royal bowel movements, it's safe to assume the palace privies were not always places of glory. Public health responses were non-existent. The concept of sanitation barely existed, and most people thought disease came from bad smells rather than contaminated matter. So, to fight dysentery, Londoners burned herbs, sprayed perfume, or carried fragrant pomanders around their necks. The streets smelled faintly of lavender and regret. Actual cleaning, on the other hand, was considered unnecessary. Dysentery also reshaped how people viewed food. Cooked meals were safer, but raw vegetables grown in fields fertilized with human waste were miniature hand grenades. The wealthy boasted of their fine kitchens, but even the grandest banquet could become a gastrointestinal tragedy. The Tudors didn't talk about food poisoning, but they certainly experienced it. One unlucky feast could turn a wedding into a wake, and yet, despite all this, dysentery rarely made the headlines of Tudor horror. It lacked the spectacle of the plague, the mystery of the sweating sickness, or the sinful intrigue of syphilis, but it killed quietly, consistently, and across every social boundary. From palace to pigsty, from general to beggar, everyone eventually found themselves humbled by the same grim truth. No matter how powerful you were, you still had to go. Dysentery was the great equalizer, the disease that stripped away every pretense of dignity. It was a reminder that even in an age of kings and conquests, humans were at the mercy of the smallest, most invisible foes, and that the mightiest empire could still be undone by a bad drink of water. Of all the strange figures to haunt Tudor London, none were quite as unsettling or unintentionally fashionable as the plague doctor. Cloaked in black from head to toe, face hidden behind glass lenses and a long curved beak, they looked less like physicians and more like ravens who had just graduated from medical school. They looked like birds and smelled like salad. But hey, it was a look. To understand the rise of the plague doctor, one must first understand the chaos they walked into. Tudor England had no formal medical system. Doctors were a mixed bag of university-trained physicians, barber surgeons with sharp knives and no conscience, and apothecaries who measured health in spoonfuls of crushed herbs. When plague struck, most of them fled the city faster than you could say quarantine. Those who stayed needed protection, not from germs which they didn't know existed, but from miasma, the invisible bad air believed to carry disease. Enter the plague doctor's outfit, the world's most terrifying early hazmat suit. The costume as we imagine it today, with the bird-like mask, long waxed robe, gloves, boots and wide-brimmed hat, didn't appear until the 17th century, but its roots began in the late Tudor world. The concept of covering the body and purifying the air was already popular. Tudor physicians wore long coats, stuffed their sleeves with fragrant herbs, and held posies or pomanders, small metal spheres filled with spices or flowers, to their noses when visiting patients. It was less about sterile procedure and more about fighting stench with scent. If London smelled like death, at least they could die smelling of rosemary. By the late 1500s, the idea evolved into something far more theatrical. The full plague doctor ensemble was designed by Charles Delirium, physician to the French court, but the English quickly adopted versions of it. The long black oilcloth robe covered every inch of the wearer, sealing them from the infected air. The beaked mask, undoubtedly the highlight of the outfit, was stuffed with herbs like lavender, mint, cloves and wormwood. These were believed to purify the air before it reached the lungs. The result was a doctor who reeked like a festive stew, but was considered the height of medical wisdom. Of course, the look had side effects. The glass lenses fogged constantly. The waxed robe made summer visits unbearable, and the beak itself was an auditory nightmare. Imagine trying to talk through a foot of leather shaped like a duck's nose while standing in a room filled with screaming patients. Communication was impossible, which may have been the only merciful part of the encounter. The long cane the doctors carried served multiple purposes. It was used to point at patients, lift sheets, and on occasion, poke people from a safe distance, an early form of social distancing with extra dramatics. Some even used the cane to shoo away desperate relatives. The idea was to avoid touching anything, which, ironically, made them the most hygienic people in the city by accident. Tudor medicine was a carnival of bad ideas, but this one accidentally bordered on brilliance. The plague doctor quickly became both a symbol and a spectacle. To the public, their arrival in a neighbourhood meant doom was near. The sight of that long black silhouette gliding through the fog sent people scurrying indoors. Children were warned that the beaked man will come if they misbehaved, which was effective because who wouldn't behave with a 6-foot crow at the door? Their presence was meant to reassure citizens that something was being done, but it usually meant quite the opposite. The doctors themselves weren't exactly heroes. Many were underqualified, hired not for their expertise but for their willingness to stay in infected areas. Some were recent graduates, others failed physicians, and a few were outright frauds who saw plague work as an opportunity to earn money, and occasionally loot abandoned homes. Payment was often conditional. They were promised high fees if they survived long enough to collect them. It was the 16th century equivalent of hazard pay, with more hazards than pay. When treating patients, their methods were predictably medieval. They lanced buboes, swollen plague sores to drain the poison, applied poultices of herbs, and recommended prayer or repentance. Some carried portable furnaces to burn sulphur in patients' homes, fumigating both the sick and the living into unconsciousness. A good visit ended with the doctor walking away. A bad one ended with him joining his patients in the burial pit. Despite the grim work, plague doctors inadvertently made history. Their outfits represented the first attempt at protective clothing in medicine. The beaked mask, though ridiculous, functioned as a primitive respirator, filtering out large particles and reducing exposure to fleas, the real culprits behind the plague. Without meaning to, these bird-like figures laid the groundwork for modern biohazard suits. They didn't know it, but they were pioneers of infection control, albeit in a form that would terrify a carnival. Beyond their medical efforts, plague doctors became cultural icons. Artists depicted them in woodcuts, pamphlets and plays. To the Tudors, they were both fascinating and horrifying, the walking embodiment of death wrapped in science. The public alternated between revering them and mocking them. Satirical ballads joked that the only thing more contagious than the plague was the doctor's breath under that mask. Their costume also inspired fashion commentary, because of course it did. The wide-brimmed hat was considered the mark of authority, though it also made them look like depressed wizards. The waxed cloaks squeaked loudly as they moved, lending every house call an unintentionally dramatic entrance. If a Tudor had invented the term goth, they would have applied it to these men, brooding, black-clad and haunting the streets after dark. Still, for all their theatricality, plague doctors gave people something vital. Hope, however, misplaced. Their presence meant that someone was still willing to face the horror, even if it was through layers of leather and a beak full of herbs. In a time when death seemed unstoppable, the image of a human choosing to walk among the dying, no matter how absurdly dressed, was strangely comforting. By the end of the Tudor period, the figure of the plague doctor had become mythic, part healer, part omen, part walking air freshener. The costume would outlive the dynasty itself, carried forward into the centuries of plague that followed. To modernize, it looks absurd, but in its time it was a symbol of defiance, a desperate attempt to turn fear into fashion and superstition into science. Medicine, in Tudor London, was not for the faint of heart or the faint of stomach. In an age when no one understood germs, viruses, or even basic sanitation, the line between doctor and torturer was distressingly thin. People went to physicians not necessarily to get better, but to demonstrate their bravery. Feeling ill, your options were pain, more pain, or spontaneous death. The Tudor medical system was built on one beautiful, disastrous theory: the balance of the four humours. These humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were thought to govern every aspect of health and personality. If you were sluggish, you had too much phlegm. If you were angry, you had too much yellow bile. If you were bleeding to death, that was apparently progress. The solution to almost every ailment involved restoring balance, which usually meant letting large amounts of blood leave your body as quickly as possible. Bleeding was practically a national sport. You had a fever, bleed, headache, bleed, tuberculosis, definitely bleed. The logic was simple: remove the excess humour and health would return. Unfortunately, this method had one minor flaw. It didn't work. Physicians sliced open veins with small knives, or used specially designed cups to suck the blood out. Sometimes they attached heated glass bulbs to the skin to draw blood upward before cutting it. Patients often fainted before feeling better, which doctors took as a sign of success. They'd say, the bad humours have departed, as did most of your circulation. If a doctor wanted to outsource the job, he turned to his most loyal assistant, the leech. These slimy little vampires were the Tudor equivalent of a prescription pill. Doctors applied leeches to the neck, arms, or even inside the nose. Yes, really, to gently draw blood. In theory, this was more refined than cutting veins. In practice, it was just a slower, itchier form of torture. The leeches often escaped and multiplied, creating the world's most unsettling home infestation. But people swore by them. In a world where cures rarely worked, not immediately dying counted as progress. Then there were the purges. If bleeding didn't balance your humours, clearly you needed to vomit or defecate until it did. Apothecaries created powerful concoctions to cleanse the body, which usually meant turning your insides into a water park. Ingredients included everything from aloe and vinegar to crushed beetles and mercury. The more violently it worked, the more effective it was considered. People actually bragged about how much a remedy made them retch. If it didn't make you see God, it wasn't strong enough. Some treatments were so bizarre they sound like satire. One popular remedy for plague involved strapping a freshly killed pigeon carcass to your armpit. The theory? The bird's body would absorb the poison from your flesh. The result? One dead bird. One very confused patient, and no improvement whatsoever. Others recommended sleeping with onions on your chest, swallowing powdered toads, or applying cow dung poultices to open wounds. Nature, they believed, provided cures for everything, if you were brave or desperate enough to smear them on your skin. Herbal medicine was slightly more reasonable, but only slightly. Apothecaries sold dried roots, boiled herbs, and tonics so bitter they could strip paint. Recipes were passed down through generations, often scribbled in the same household books as pie recipes: wormwood for digestion, sage for memory, mint for the breath you lost after drinking all that wormwood. Some of these remedies had a kernel of truth. Herbs like lavender and rosemary had mild antiseptic properties, but dosage and hygiene were a matter of personal creativity. boil until thick, one recipe might say, or add honey until it stops tasting like despair. Then there was surgery, Tudor medicine's most horrifying chapter. Surgeons were technically a separate profession from physicians, but their qualifications rarely extended beyond Owen's knives. Without anaesthesia, surgery was a combination of speed and screaming. Amputations, tumour removals, and dental extractions all happened with the patient fully conscious, often biting on a stick to keep from breaking their teeth. The surgeon's toolkit looked like something from a torture chamber: saws, hooks, clamps, and cauterizing irons. Infection, of course, was inevitable. The lucky ones fainted. The unlucky ones lived long enough to regret it. Even dentistry, if you could call it that, was an adventure. Toothaches were treated with clove oil, prayers or pliers. Barber surgeons, yes, the same men who cut hair, handled extractions. Their red and white poles symbolized the blood and bandages of their trade. Getting a haircut and a tooth pulled in one visit was considered convenient. Open wide, they'd say, before yanking your molar with the same hands that had just sharpened scissors. Hygiene was not part of the curriculum, and when all else failed, there was always alchemy, a blend of chemistry, mysticism, and wishful thinking. Alchemists promised to transform disease into health, the same way they hoped to turn lead into gold. They sold elixirs with names like the water of life or the balm of paradise, made from mysterious ingredients such as unicorn horn, dragon's blood, and ground emeralds. The Tudors didn't have pharmaceuticals, they had fan fiction with ingredients. Religious remedies also held sway. Priests performed blessings, sprinkled holy water, and urged confession. The church saw illness as both physical and spiritual punishment, so curing the soul often took priority over curing the body. Pilgrimages to shrines were common because if bleeding and leeches failed, walking 100 miles in sandals might do the trick. The result of all this was predictable. For every patient who recovered, hundreds didn't, either from the disease or the treatment. Yet faith in these methods endured. People wanted to believe in something, anything, that promised control over chaos. And even when those cures were clearly worse than the illness, they gave a comforting illusion that medicine, however painful, was progress. In truth, Tudor medicine was less about healing and more about surviving long enough to complain about it. Every remedy, no matter how outlandish, reflected one simple truth: the desperate hope that the human body could be reasoned with. It couldn't, of course, but hope, like bleeding, was one thing the Tudors had in endless supply. If Tudor medicine was a gamble, then apothecaries were the bookies, cheerfully taking your money while pretending to understand the odds. Their shops were the beating, bubbling heart of Tudor healthcare, part pharmacy, part curiosity cabinet, part public hazard. Glass jars filled with colourful powders lined the shelves, bundles of dried herbs dangled from the ceiling, and mysterious smells wafted through the air, a mix of mint, mildew, and mild panic. Every cure promised miracles, most delivered funerals. Apothecaries were supposed to be the practical side of medicine, unlike physicians who spoke Latin and charged by the syllable, or surgeons who preferred to remove limbs rather than heal them. Apothecaries actually made and sold remedies. They ground herbs, mixed tonics, distilled tinctures, and brewed elixirs to treat everything from headaches to heartbreak. In theory, they were the ancestors of pharmacists. In practice, they were part chemist, part gossip, part magician. Their ingredients were a global tour of the bazaar. Thanks to England's expanding trade routes, Tudor apothecaries had access to an astonishing array of substances: cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from the Spice Islands, saffron from Spain, and sugar from the Caribbean, all delightful until you realised they were mixed with things like powdered skull, ground pearls, and dried toad. Some shops even stocked mummy powder. Yes, actual ground-up mummies imported from Egypt, believed to have powerful healing properties. Nothing said health tonic like drinking a dead pharaoh. The shelves were an organised chaos of wonder and danger. Bottles labelled in elegant script promised relief from the flux, melancholy, ag-gore, or vapours. There were tonics to make you sleep, wake up, vomit, sweat, or if you were lucky, just feel funny for a few hours. Most of these potions worked about as well as drinking perfume, which incidentally was also something people tried. For headaches, apothecaries offered dried roses, vinegar compresses, or oil of frog. For toothaches, there was clove oil, opium, or the always popular put a dead mouse on it. Customers came from every class. The rich wanted imported remedies sealed in expensive jars, while the poor settled for whatever smelled the least like disappointment. Apprentices scurried behind the counters, grinding roots and pestling powders, their sleeves caked with mysterious residues. The air was thick with dust, smoke and ambition. A Tudor apothecary could sell hope in a bottle, and Londoners, desperate for relief from their city's many plagues and miseries, bought it gladly. And where apothecaries ended, quacks began. The quack doctor was a fixture of Tudor life, loud, confident, and about as qualified as your neighbour's dog. They set up stalls in marketplaces, shouting about their miracle tonics that cured gout, plague, baldness and broken hearts, sometimes all in one bottle. They called their wares things like the Sovereign Elixir or Dr. Merriweather's Universal Cordial, and they made fortunes off of human gullibility. If scepticism was a cure, Tudor England would have been immortal. One particularly popular quack cure was snake oil, an oily concoction supposedly drawn from exotic serpents, but more likely made from olive oil and lies. Others sold powder of sympathy, meant to heal wounds by treating the weapon that caused them. Got stabbed? Don't bandage the wound, just dip the knife in ointment and hope for the best. This was the high science of the day, and somehow it occasionally worked, mostly because the human body is stubbornly good at fixing itself despite humanity's best efforts. Apothecaries themselves weren't all villains. Many genuinely tried to help. They were trained through long apprenticeships and had to master the art of measurement, which was no small feat in an age before standardized scales. A pinch too much opium, and you'd cure your cough permanently. They experimented constantly, testing herbs and minerals, often blending legitimate medicine with sheer superstition. For every harmful potion they sold, there might be one that actually eased suffering. But in the Tudor mind, success and failure were both part of the divine mystery. If you died, well, that was just God's prescription. The apothecary's trade was as much theatre as science. They mixed their medicines with flourish, spoke in dramatic tones, and always threw in a foreign-sounding ingredient for credibility. Ah yes, they'd say, a touch of terra sigillata from the Isle of Lemnos, which sounded impressive, even if it was just red clay. To the customer, exotic meant effective. The more complicated the Latin, the more certain you were to feel at least morally healed. Royalty, too, relied on apothecaries. The Tudor court kept them close at hand to prepare everything from cough syrup for the king to cosmetic creams for the queen. Queen Elizabeth I herself was known to use concoctions of honey, vinegar and egg whites for her complexion, though her famous white face was actually the result of lead-based makeup, a beauty regime that doubled as slow poisoning. Court apothecaries also crafted treacle, a thick medicinal syrup touted as an antidote to all poisons. Ironically, it sometimes contained opium, making patients feel much better until it didn't. For the poor, however, apothecaries were both a blessing and a gamble. Their prices were lower than a physician's, and at least they handed you something tangible. But unregulated medicine meant every purchase was a risk. Some apothecaries watered down their products or reused ingredients scraped from returned bottles. Others cut expensive spices with sawdust or dirt to increase profits. Buyer beware wasn't a warning, it was a lifestyle. Religious faith often intertwined with these remedies. Many apothecaries sold holy water tonics or saint powders, allegedly blessed for divine efficacy. A few even operated within church walls. Their shelves nestled beside altars. The blending of faith and pharmaceuticals made customers feel they were buying both medicine and mercy in the same vial. But the most tragic element of Tudor medicine was its optimism. People genuinely believed they could cure anything with the right powder, potion or prayer. They didn't lack intelligence, they lacked microscopes. When your entire city reeked of decay, it was comforting to think salvation came in liquid form, neatly bottled, corked and priced at 2 shillings. In a sense, apothecaries and quacks were reflections of their world. Creative, desperate and endlessly entrepreneurial, they turned sickness into spectacle and pain into profit. And while most of their patients didn't live to leave 5-star reviews, their legacy remains, proof that humanity's desire for healing will always outpace its understanding of what's killing it. If Tudor medicine failed to cure you, and it usually did, there was always one explanation left: divine punishment. In an age when people believed God personally managed everything from the weather to your toothache, sickness wasn't just a medical problem, it was a moral one. If you sneezed too hard, someone assumed you'd angered God, not the germs. Religion was the lens through which the Tudors viewed the entire world, and disease was no exception. To them, every fever, cough, and rash had a spiritual cause. Illness was a sign that God was displeased, that your soul or perhaps the nations needed cleansing. The plague wasn't just a biological catastrophe, it was a divine memo written in boils and death tolls. The Church called it God's correction, which sounds much gentler than mass mortality. Priests filled pulpits with sermons that explained outbreaks as punishment for sin, lust, greed, vanity, laziness. It didn't matter what the offence was. Disease was the divine fine you paid for it. The worse the epidemic, the more sinful people were presumed to be. It was an elegant system. When things went wrong, you didn't need doctors or scientists. You needed confession and repentance. And conveniently, both could be found at your local church, open daily and accepting donations. Of course, this religious framework didn't just shape belief, it shaped behaviour. During epidemics, processions filled the streets, priests carrying crosses and chanting prayers for mercy. People whipped themselves with ropes or chains to prove their humility, hoping pain would please the Almighty. Others made pilgrimages to holy sites like Canterbury, trudging for miles through filth and fever to beg for healing. The irony was hard to miss. Thousands marched together, breathing on one another and spreading the very plague they were praying against. Faith was powerful. Germs were just more efficient. But religious explanations also brought comfort. To a Tudor Londoner surrounded by death, the idea that sickness had meaning was far less terrifying than randomness. If God sent disease, at least he was in control. You could pray, fast, and cleanse your soul, and maybe, just maybe, he'd spare you. It was spiritual cause and effect, like divine customer service. The problem was that not everyone agreed on what exactly had angered him. When the Reformation hit England in the 1530s, the question of who speaks for God became more complicated than ever. Catholics and Protestants alike claimed their rivals were the reason for divine wrath. If plague struck, each side pointed fingers. See, God's punishing you for heresy. Entire pamphlets were printed explaining how false doctrine caused outbreaks. It was less theology, more a national blame game with corpses as footnotes. Every new outbreak reignited the same debates. Were the people being punished for pride, for witchcraft, for not attending Mass often enough? Even natural events, bad harvests, fires, comets were lumped into the same moral narrative. To be healthy was to be righteous, to be sick was to be suspect. Compassion was mixed with judgment, and pity often came with a side of gossip. Superstition filled the gaps where faith wavered. People carried religious charms, tiny crosses, relics, and amulets containing verses of scripture, saints' bones, or more likely, bits of animal bone with good marketing, were worn around the neck for protection. Holy water was sprinkled on doorways, sometimes mixed with vinegar for good measure, and of course prayers to patron saints multiplied like symptoms. Saint Roche was invoked against plague, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Sebastian for protection from arrows of pestilence. If one saint failed, you simply tried another. The Tudor approach to divine medicine was not unlike modern customer service. Keep calling until someone picks up. At the same time, darker explanations crept in. Some believed the devil himself sent disease to test faith or tempt despair. Demonic possession was a common diagnosis for mysterious illnesses, especially mental ones. Fits, seizures, or sudden madness were seen not as neurological conditions, but as spiritual warfare. The afflicted were prayed over, restrained, or exorcised, a process that combined chanting, shouting, and occasionally mild assault. Many probably needed doctors, but what they got was theology with shouting. Witchcraft became another convenient scapegoat. If someone recovered from illness unexpectedly, it was a miracle. If someone fell sick suddenly, it must have been their neighbour's fault. Women who brewed herbal remedies or lived alone were easy targets. A few whispered rumours, and suddenly Goody Margaret was standing trial for causing your rheumatism with a cursed stew. It was a dangerous time to have good aim with a mortar and pestle. Religious leaders, meanwhile, used epidemics as opportunities for moral reform. Plague orders were often accompanied by public fasts, bans on gambling, theatre and dancing. all those sinful distractions that clearly invited divine wrath. Londoners were told to pray harder and party less, as though joy itself were contagious. Even laughter was suspect when surrounded by so much death. The city became a cathedral of repentance, its people kneeling before God and coughing between prayers. And yet, even in all this moral chaos, faith provided resilience. Churches became the emotional backbone of Tudor communities. When medicine failed and doctors fled, priests stayed. They buried the dead, comforted the living, and reminded everyone that salvation, if not health, was still attainable. For all the fear and superstition, religion gave people language to cope with disaster. It turned panic into prayer, grief into ritual, and death into destiny. Still, it's hard not to admire the Tudor ability to see divine meaning in everything. A cough wasn't just a cough, it was spiritual commentary. A fever was God's way of saying, clean your soul. Every illness, from the plague to the common cold, came with moral overtones. It wasn't until centuries later that people finally realised you didn't need sin to catch a cold, just a friend who sneezed on you. But in Tudor London, God was everywhere, especially in the diagnosis. The physician held the knife, but the priest held the explanation. Between them stood the patient, hoping one could save the body while the other spared the soul. Sometimes neither succeeded, but at least you had options. When Tudor Londoners couldn't find a cure for their illnesses, and after 12 chapters we can safely say they rarely did, they found someone to blame. In an age where every cough had cosmic meaning, logic wasn't the first response. Suspicion was, caught the plague. Clearly your neighbour's cat made a pact with the devil. The line between medicine and magic was so thin in Tudor England that most people didn't bother trying to separate them. The same woman who sold you a herbal tonic for your stomachache might also give you a charm to ward off the evil eye. Healing and sorcery were sisters, sometimes twins, and anyone who dealt in either could find themselves hailed as a miracle worker one week and accused of witchcraft the next. Witches were blamed for everything from failed crops to toothaches, but disease was their specialty. If you woke up with a fever, it wasn't because you'd been drinking river water that doubled as a sewage system, it was because someone hexed you. Superstition filled the gaps where science hadn't yet shown up. And in Tudor London there were a lot of gaps. People firmly believed that spells, curses, and demonic influence could bring sickness upon the innocent. And if you happened to have a quarrelsome neighbour, a black cat, or the misfortune of being poor, elderly, or female, you were a prime suspect. Healers and midwives often bore the brunt of this paranoia. These women were essential to their communities. They delivered babies, brewed remedies, and tended to the sick when doctors refused to visit. But their knowledge of herbs and anatomy made people uneasy. How did she know which roots cured fever? How did she know when someone was about to die? It couldn't possibly be experience or intuition. It had to be witchcraft. It was a lose-lose career. Save too many lives and you were unnatural. Save too few and you were malicious. When disease swept through a village or neighbourhood, panic quickly turned to accusation. Communities that had no understanding of infection looked for human faces to pin the blame on. A cow dying of an infection might be linked to the old widow who once glared at its owner. A stillborn child? A neighbour must have cursed the mother's womb. The logic was impeccable by Tudor standards. Because they couldn't see bacteria, they saw malice. The infamous witch trials of the later 16th century often began with outbreaks. Fear bred desperation, and desperation needed scapegoats. The 1560s and 1570s saw surges in witch accusations across England, especially during periods of illness and famine. The script rarely changed. A community fell ill, someone recalled an argument with a peculiar old woman, and suddenly she was seen muttering to herself near a sickly pig. Within weeks she was dragged before a local magistrate, accused of killing livestock, spreading plague, or turning the baker's wife's skin green. Witch hunters and cunning men made their living off these fears. The cunning folk, ironically, were the very people accused witches resembled folk healers who offered magical protection. They sold charms, herbs, and counter-curses to defend against black magic. Need to break a spell? They'd give you a bottle of holy water mixed with iron filings and rosemary. Or, for a little extra, they'd recite Latin phrases they'd only half memorised. For Tudor Londoners, paying for a curse-breaking charm was the same as buying health insurance. It didn't always work, but it helped you sleep better. Accusations of witchcraft didn't always end with execution, but they always left ruin. Those found guilty, or merely unlucky, were publicly humiliated, forced to confess or imprisoned. Some were swum in rivers to test their guilt. If they floated, they were witches. If they sank, they were innocent and drowned. This flawless investigative method only proved one thing: Tudor logic worked best in theory, not practice. Animals also found themselves under suspicion. Cats, dogs, rats, and even toads were believed to be familiars, demonic companions who helped witches spread illness. Black cats especially got a terrible reputation. In London's crowded alleys where vermin thrived, this was especially tragic. Killing cats, which were the best defence against plague-carrying rats, only made epidemics worse. It was a deadly feedback loop. Fewer cats meant more rats meant more fleas, and more fleas meant more funerals. The devil, if he was watching, must have been impressed by the efficiency. Superstition didn't stop with witches. Ordinary citizens used everyday magic to protect themselves from sickness. Amulets made from coral, silver or knotted thread were worn around the neck. Children's cradles were decorated with protective charms, and doorways were marked with chalk crosses. Herbs like rue and sage were tucked into clothing to ward off evil spirits or at least unpleasant smells. People whispered incantations over their food and carried written prayers in their pockets, as if God needed a memo reminding him to keep them healthy. Even respectable doctors dabbled in superstition. Many wore rings engraved with mystical symbols or carried talismans to repel pestilence. Astrological charts were considered essential tools for diagnosing illness. The position of Mars could determine whether your liver was out of balance, and Saturn was blamed for melancholy vapours. A physician without an almanac was like a surgeon without a knife, useless and unfashionable. Of course, the church had opinions about all this folk medicine. Officially, magic was condemned as heresy and diabolical trickery. Unofficially, many priests used the same charms, simply swapping out pagan phrases for Latin prayers. A healing spell became holy blessing with the right vocabulary. In the end, it was all branding. What makes Tudor superstition so fascinating is how universal it was. Educated nobles consulted astrologers, peasants wore charms, monarchs sought divine signs in comets and eclipses. Henry VIII himself had an entire team of royal soothsayers to predict his health and success. Elizabeth I employed John Dee, a mathematician, alchemist and part-time conjurer, to read the stars for her reign. When even the Queen's physician occasionally talked to angels, it's hard to blame the baker's wife for suspecting her neighbour's cat. Superstition filled the cracks left by fear, ignorance and chaos. It gave people a sense of control in a world that made no sense. When medicine failed, when prayers seemed unanswered, magic offered a middle ground between despair and denial. If the world was ruled by invisible forces, at least you could try to bargain with them. And so, amid the herbs, holy water, and whispered curses, Tudor Londoners built their strange superstitious peace. The city may have reeked of death, but it was also alive with belief, half prayer, half potion, all hope. If you ever feel frustrated with modern healthcare, long wait times, confusing paperwork, questionable bedside manners, just remember the Tudors had it worse, much worse. Their idea of public health was simple. If someone got sick, pray they moved away. The Tudor idea of healthcare was hoping the sick person moved away. Tudor London was a city bursting at the seams and leaking from every corner, overcrowded, filthy, and utterly unprepared for the waves of disease that swept through it. It was less a functioning capital and more a test of human endurance. The average Londoner lived elbow to elbow with strangers, livestock, and enough germs to start a biological war. Sanitation as a concept had not yet been invented. The streets were open-air sewers, and public health policy consisted mostly of look away and breathe shallowly. There were no proper hospitals for the majority of citizens. Monastic hospitals had existed in the Middle Ages, but Henry VIII's Reformation shut down the monasteries in the 1530s, and with them went most of the institutions that cared for the sick and poor. Overnight, England lost its closest thing to a healthcare system. The monks and nuns who attended to lepers, plague victims and the dying were replaced with no one. The crown got richer, but the sick got colder. A few new hospitals eventually appeared, St. Bartholomew's, St. Thomas and St. Sant, and St. Mary's among them. but these were small, overwhelmed, and reserved for the deserving poor. If you were old, idle, or morally questionable, which covered most of London, you were out of luck. Hospitals weren't places of healing so much as places to die more quietly. Treatments were primitive, beds were few, and conditions made the modern emergency room look like a 5-star spa. The best thing a Tudor patient could hope for was a clean shroud and a priest on standby. The government, such as it was, did occasionally attempt public health measures, but they were as crude as they were desperate. When plague struck, authorities ordered quarantines. Infected houses were sealed with painted crosses on their doors, and the ominous phrase, "Lord have mercy upon us." Guards were stationed outside to make sure no one escaped. It was less about curing the sick and more about containing them. The healthy fled the city, while the poor were left behind to marinate in disease. Quarantine was the only policy that technically worked, mostly because it killed everyone inside. The city's sanitation or lack thereof was legendary even by the standards of the 16th century. Waste disposal was a personal affair. Everyone dumped their refuse into the nearest street, ditch or river. The Thames was London's toilet, garbage can, and water source all at once. Tanneries poured chemicals into it. Butchers tossed animal guts, and citizens added their own contributions nightly via chamber pot. On warm days, the stench could knock a person unconscious at 10 paces, and yet, people still drank from it. If irony were fatal, the entire population would have vanished by 1550. Public latrines existed, but you wouldn't want to use them. They were communal pits that quickly overflowed and were rarely cleaned. Some citizens used gong farmers, men paid to dig out and carry away human waste, but they often dumped it into nearby rivers anyway. Imagine a job so bad you'd rather face the plague than clock in. The gong farmers were the unsung and unwashed heroes of Tudor public health. Without them, London would have drowned in its own filth, though some weeks it nearly did. As for water supply, wells were common but rarely safe. They were often dug next to cesspits or animal pens, because no one quite grasped that what goes in the ground might end up back in the bucket. It wasn't until someone noticed that the smell of the well matched the smell of the sewer that questions were raised. Still, the Tudor response was not fix the sanitation system but add more perfume. To make matters worse, the city had no organised garbage collection. Waste piled up until rain washed it away, or until someone set it on fire. Public health was left in the hands of local parishes, whose main tools were fines, shaming, and prayer. If your street was filthy, the church wardens might scold you. If it stayed filthy, they'd pray for you. Either way, nothing got cleaned. Even when disease tore through London, coordination was non-existent. There was no Ministry of Health, no citywide plan, no data collection beyond parish death registers. Information travelled slower than the infection. By the time the authorities realised a plague had returned, half the city was already coughing. But it wasn't all neglect. There were small, earnest efforts to impose order. Tudor councils occasionally passed laws requiring butchers to operate outside city walls, banning the dumping of animal remains in streets. Tanneries were told to move downstream. Graveyards were ordered to bury deeper, since shallow pits had a nasty habit of exhuming themselves after heavy rain. These were sensible ideas, if anyone bothered enforcing them. Most of the time, officials ignored the rules until they themselves fell ill, which was nature's way of filing a complaint. Charity often filled the void left by government inaction. Wealthy citizens funded almhouses and poor relief efforts more for the salvation of their souls than their neighbours' bodies. Priests and parish officers distributed bread, money, and occasionally herbal concoctions to the sick. During major epidemics, volunteers, or the desperate unemployed, were hired to bury corpses, though it was a job that came with poor career longevity. The rich, of course, had their own version of public health, private health. When plague arrived, they packed up their belongings, their servants and their favourite goblets, and fled to their country estates. The flight to safety became a seasonal ritual. Meanwhile, the city's working class was left behind to tend shops, care for the dying and keep society functioning. Disease, like everything else in Tudor London, observed class hierarchy, but not perfectly. It occasionally visited nobles just to remind them that money bought distance, not immunity. What made Tudor public health remarkable, in a grim way, was how much it relied on faith and fatalism. People accepted filth and death as the natural order. Clean streets were a luxury. Cleanliness itself was sometimes seen as vanity. Illness was simply the price of being human, or as one Tudor preacher put it, the Lord's broom to sweep the unworthy from the earth. Practical sanitation reforms would take centuries, but the Tudor mindset laid the groundwork for one key discovery. Before you can fix public health, you have to invent it. Until then, the city survived on hope, habit, and sheer stubbornness. Londoners trudged through muck and miasma, clutching their posies, muttering their prayers, and dreaming of a day when health didn't depend on luck or social class. In the Tudor world, survival wasn't guaranteed by medicine, government, or divine grace. It was guaranteed by endurance and perhaps a strong stomach. In Tudor London, death wasn't just a part of life, it was real estate. The city expanded both upward with new houses and downward with new cemeteries. When plague season hit, Londoners didn't just lose neighbours, they gained new underground roommates. Beneath the bustling markets, echoing churches and creaking taverns, entire layers of plague pits sprawled like grim fossils of human panic. The problem was simple. Too many dead, not enough ground. Tudor London's population had ballooned to over 200,000 souls by the late 16th century, packed into a cramped maze of wooden houses, alleys, and open sewers. When plague arrived, and it always did, it spread faster than gossip. Within weeks, entire parishes were struck down, and churchyards filled faster than gravediggers could dig. The air above London buzzed with the sounds of bells, shovels, and despair. At first, the dead were buried in individual graves, wrapped in linen shrouds and placed with modest ceremony. But when the death toll soared into the thousands, ceremony went out the window and straight into the pit. Parish churchyards overflowed and the ground itself rebelled. Graves were dug so shallow that dogs scavenging for scraps sometimes unearthed limbs. Rain washed soil away, exposing fragments of coffin and bone. The smell, according to contemporary accounts, could knock a man flat. For a city obsessed with divine punishment, it was as if God had decided to make his point through the nose. That's when the authorities resorted to mass graves, plague pits as they were grimly called. These were vast trenches dug on the outskirts of the city, where corpses could be stacked, layer upon layer, like macabre lasagna. Once a pit reached capacity, it was sealed with quicklime, a caustic chemical meant to speed decay and suppress the stench. It rarely worked. The earth itself seemed to breathe sickness. Some of London's most infamous plague pits lay in places that are now public parks, schools or quiet gardens. Finsbury Fields, Charterhouse Square and Aldgate all hid their share of the dead. Every time a construction crew in modern London hits unexpected archaeological material, it's usually a polite way of saying we just found another pit of Tudors. The city is literally built on its own history, and much of that history still has teeth. The gravediggers, or bearers, were among the few people guaranteed employment during plague time, though it was not a job with great long-term prospects. They worked through the night, dragging carts piled with corpses to the pits. The constant sound of the death cart became the soundtrack of the city, its squeaking wheels accompanied by the hollow cry of "Bring out your dead." Bearers were often poor, desperate, or already half sick themselves. Some wrapped cloths soaked in vinegar around their faces to fend off the miasma, while others simply got drunk before starting their shift. It was the only way to make the smell, or the sorrow, bearable. The sight of these carts was enough to drain hope from a neighbourhood. London's narrow lanes echoed with the clatter of wheels and the heavy silence that followed. Windows slammed shut, doors barred, prayers whispered. The bearers trudged through the dark like ghosts collecting their own kind. If they were lucky, they lived long enough to finish the week. If not, they became part of their cargo. Even burial records couldn't keep up. Parish clerks tried valiantly to list the names of the deceased, but after a certain point, they simply wrote "many dead" or "infinite." It was an understatement worthy of Tudor stoicism. Death had become so routine that it no longer required detail, only arithmetic. Fear of contagion transformed funerals into hurried transactions. The sick died alone, the dead were buried at night, and mourners stayed indoors. Churches forbade ringing bells or holding long ceremonies, lest crowds gather and spread the plague further. Burial became mechanical, a civic duty rather than a sacred act. For a society that saw death as a prelude to divine judgment, this was deeply unsettling. Souls were meant to be prayed over, not shovelled in by torchlight. The sheer number of bodies created new problems, geological ones. The shallow graves and mass pits often contaminated nearby wells and streams. The stench of decay, which the Tudors believed carried disease, seeped into the air. People sprinkled vinegar and burned herbs to mask it, but the smell was impossible to ignore. Entire districts took on a permanent odour of rotten lime. For many Londoners, plague had no face. It had a scent, and yet, in a strange way, the burial pits symbolised London's resilience. Tendon. They were brutal, yes, but they were also acts of survival. The city learned, through catastrophe, to adapt. Gravediggers became essential workers. Pits were dug strategically outside walls. Death, while relentless, was managed with grim efficiency. The pits were the city's dark lungs breathing in the dead, so the living could keep going. There were moments of unexpected compassion too. Some priests risked their lives to bless the pits before they were filled, whispering prayers over mounds of bodies whose names they'd never know. Families sometimes followed the carts from a distance, unable to touch their loved ones, but unwilling to let them vanish entirely into the night. The plague stripped London bare, but it also revealed something enduring beneath the fear, a stubborn insistence on remembrance, even when memory itself seemed too heavy to carry. The aftermath was as haunting as the event itself. When outbreaks subsided, new houses were built atop old burial grounds. Streets were paved over forgotten cemeteries. No one wanted to remember, but the earth never forgot. Every few decades, new construction unearthed old bones, reminders of the city's buried history. Even in death, Tudor London refused to stay still. To live in that city was to coexist with ghosts. Every churchyard and field concealed layers of the dead. Each plague pit a time capsule of panic, yet London persisted, stinking, scarred, and somehow stronger for it. Beneath its cobblestones lay the bones of those who built it, a silent foundation of endurance. The burial pits may have been grim, but they were proof of a people who refused to surrender to despair. In their chaos, the Tudors created an accidental monument to survival, a city that grew not just above its dead, but because of them. In Tudor London, a visit to the barber could mean leaving lighter in more ways than one. You might lose a few inches of hair or a few pints of blood. Your barber would trim your beard and your arteries. 2 services, 1 scream. Before the neat divide between doctors, surgeons and hairdressers existed, the Tudor barber-surgeon was a multi-purpose craftsman whose toolkit looked equally suited for grooming or torture. These men occupied the messy intersection between medicine and mechanics. Physicians diagnosed from afar, cloaked in Latin and dignity. Surgeons actually touched the body, and usually cut into it. In a world without anesthesia, antiseptics or even hand-washing as a concept, the barber-surgeon's motto might as well have been, "We'll try, but don't get attached." The barber-surgeon's shop was unmistakable. Outside hung a red and white striped pole, the enduring symbol of the trade. The red represented blood, the white represented the bandages used to mop it up, and the pole itself came from the stick patients gripped to keep from passing out during a bloodletting. It was the Tudor equivalent of a now open sign, if your idea of a good time included sharp metal and shouting. Inside, shelves held razors, scissors, saws, forceps and gleaming hooks, all cleaned occasionally and used frequently. The air smelled faintly of soap, sweat and regret. Surgeons of the period didn't enjoy the prestige of physicians. The university-educated doctors prescribed diets and astrological remedies. The hands-on cutters did the dirty work. They stitched sword wounds, set broken bones, pulled teeth, lanced abscesses, and performed amputations when gangrene set in. Their knowledge came from apprenticeships, not books. They learned by watching others cut and then doing it themselves. In other words, practice makes permanent was more accurate than practice makes perfect. The typical operation was fast, brutal, and horrifyingly public. Amputations were common, particularly among soldiers and labourers. Without anaesthetic, the patient's only comfort was a swig of ale and a piece of leather to bite. Assistants held him down while the surgeon worked with terrifying efficiency. A good one could remove a leg in under 2 minutes. A great one could do it before the patient fainted. The wound was then cauterized with a red-hot iron, filling the room with the smell of burning flesh and singed dignity. If the patient survived shock and infection, he might later boast about it. assuming he still had the energy to talk. Even less dramatic procedures were no picnic. Abscesses were lanced without warning, arrowheads extracted using pliers better suited for blacksmiths, and dislocated shoulders popped back into place by brute force. Stitches were made with coarse thread, and cleanliness meant wiping the blade on your apron before moving to the next person. The lucky ones got a prayer afterward. The unlucky ones became the next day's anatomy lesson. And speaking of anatomy, the Tudors were just beginning to rediscover the art of studying the human body directly. Dissection was controversial, but slowly becoming tolerated for teaching purposes. Barber surgeons, curious and practical by nature, often volunteered for this grisly education. Under the watchful eyes of students and the ever-present stench of decay, they sliced open executed criminals to map the mysteries of the flesh. These early dissections were groundbreaking, if only because someone finally admitted that guessing wasn't enough. Unfortunately, the connection between cleanliness and survival remained a mystery for another 200 years. Barber surgeons also acted as the first responders of Tudor disasters. When duels, tavern brawls, or kitchen accidents went wrong, and they frequently did, someone fetched the local surgeon. They carried portable kits containing knives, needles, cauterizing irons, and an alarming sense of optimism. They stitched the living, patched the dying, and occasionally confused the two. Payment was due up front unless you were nobility. In that case, the bill went to your heirs. In battle, surgeons were indispensable and traumatized. Tudor warfare, with its cannonballs, muskets, and blades, produced wounds that looked more like sculpting attempts than injuries. Battlefield surgeons worked amid chaos, hacking off mangled limbs as flies circled and screams echoed. They operated quickly, because infection was as deadly as the enemy. After a campaign, the surgeon's tent resembled a butcher's stall, piles of limbs, buckets of blood, and a few survivors swearing eternal gratitude or eternal vengeance. Despite their grisly work, barber surgeons were vital to London's survival. In the absence of hospitals or antibiotics, their rough skills often made the difference between life and certain death. They weren't scientists, they were craftsmen with strong stomachs and stronger nerves. The tools may have been crude, but their instincts were sharp. Many kept detailed notes of cases, comparing wounds, outcomes, and techniques. It was messy progress, but progress nonetheless. Not all barber surgeons were butchers in the worst sense. Some were innovators who paved the way for modern surgery. Ambroise Paré, a French contemporary admired even in England, revolutionized battlefield medicine by abandoning boiling oil as a wound treatment. Yes, that was a thing. His methods, using clean dressings and ligatures instead, spread slowly but steadily. English surgeons began adopting such ideas, often while still maintaining the comforting Tudor tradition of yelling, "Hold still." Of course, not everyone was impressed. Many physicians dismissed surgeons as mechanics of the flesh, useful only for manual labour. The surgeons in turn mocked physicians for diagnosing through the stars rather than through wounds. The two groups bickered for centuries, until eventually the Company of Barber Surgeons was founded in 1540 under Henry VIII's Royal Charter, a rare act of professionalisation in a chaotic field. It gave them recognition, regulation, and most importantly, the right to display the severed heads of executed criminals for anatomy lessons. Progress was a strange thing in Tudor England. Still, the barber surgeon's life was precarious. One slip of the blade, one infected patient, one unlucky cough, and they could join the dead they had tried to save. But despite the risks, they persisted, sharpening their razors each morning and trusting their luck more than their instruments. In a city choking on disease and superstition, the barber surgeon stood as both healer and hazard, a figure who bridged the gap between faith and flesh with nothing but courage and a steady hand. Their work was messy, dangerous, and often fatal, but it carved the path quite literally for everything that would follow in medical history. So next time you see that familiar red and white pole spinning outside a barber's shop, remember, it's not just a sign for a haircut. It's a relic of an age when haircuts and surgery shared the same seat, and you paid in both shillings and blood. When plague descended upon Tudor London, ordinary people prayed. The monarchs, on the other hand, packed their bags. Royal advice could be summed up in one tidy command: shut the gates and let the peasants handle it. For all their pomp and pageantry, the Tudor monarchs were as terrified of disease as everyone else. Perhaps more so, kings and queens lived surrounded by courtiers, servants and endless visitors, each one a potential walking contagion. A single infected messenger could doom the dynasty. To rule in Tudor England meant ruling at arm's length, ideally from somewhere far away from the smell of corpses and chamber pots. Henry VIII set the royal standard for fleeing illness in style. When plague or sweating sickness struck London, he didn't hesitate. He and his entire court relocated to one of his many countryside palaces, usually at a suspiciously rapid pace. In 1517, when a particularly nasty outbreak of plague swept through the capital, Henry ordered the court to Windsor, then to Woodstock, and then again elsewhere, when rumours of sickness followed. It was a royal version of musical chairs, except the loser caught bubonic plague. Henry's methods were dramatic, but not entirely irrational. He imposed strict rules on who could approach him, only those who had been away from London for 40 days, the root of our word quarantine, and who could produce a certificate of health. Anyone who violated these rules faced immediate dismissal. Or worse, if you were a courtier, you might survive Henry's temper, but you wouldn't survive his paranoia about germs. The man changed wives as easily as he changed residences, and with roughly the same emotional detachment. The king's obsession with control extended to his household staff. Servants were required to wash their hands before meals, a radical notion for the 16th century, and avoid handling money or letters from infected areas. Henry even kept his own personal apothecaries on hand, who brewed potions so strong they could double as industrial solvents. When the sweating sickness, a Tudor plague that could kill within hours, hit his court in 1528, Henry panicked so badly that he separated himself from his wife, courtiers and advisers. His letters from that time read like a hypochondriac's diary. "I beseech you, let none that hath been with the sick come near my person." Translation: if you've even heard someone cough, get out. Queen Elizabeth I inherited both her father's throne and his germophobia. By her reign, plague had become a recurring nightmare, striking London every few years like an uninvited relative. Elizabeth, ever the master of image and self-preservation, handled these crises with a mixture of policy, prayer, and regal avoidance. Whenever the death toll in London climbed too high, she swiftly relocated the court to safer ground, Richmond, Windsor, or Hatfield, leaving behind city officials to manage the chaos. Her government issued plague orders that sound suspiciously like pass the buck in bureaucratic form. These decrees instructed mayors and aldermen to quarantine infected houses, burn contaminated bedding, and ban gatherings. Theatres were closed, fairs suspended, and all unnecessary assemblies of the idle forbidden. It was sound public health policy for its time, except of course that the Queen enforced it from a distance of 20 miles. Still, Elizabeth took the symbolism of health seriously. Her image had to remain untarnished. Literally, the Virgin Queen could not appear weak or vulnerable, especially not to something as democratic as disease. During outbreaks, she limited public appearances but ensured proclamations were read in her name, reassuring citizens that divine order and royal authority remained unbroken. She was the embodiment of national stability, even if she was currently hiding behind castle walls, clutching a scented handkerchief stuffed with cloves. Royal medicine, of course, was as extravagant as their palaces. Monarchs employed entire teams of physicians, herbalists and apothecaries who produced endless tonics, balms and potions. Ingredients included gold leaf, crushed pearls, unicorn horn, usually powdered narwhal tusk, and occasionally bezoar stones from the stomachs of goats believed to neutralize poison. If it glittered, burned or cost a fortune, the Tudors would drink it. The results were mixed. Elizabeth's preferred remedy for plague prevention reportedly involved rubbing vinegar on her skin and inhaling rosemary smoke. Whether it worked or not, she outlived nearly everyone else, which might say more about her habit of leaving London than her love of herbs. Yet, even in their flight, the monarchs played a crucial role. Royal decrees shaped how England responded to disease, even if those decrees were sometimes written from behind a bolted door. Under Henry VIII, the first centralised health orders were issued, mandating quarantines and sanitary measures in plague-stricken towns. Under Elizabeth, these evolved into more formal regulations, with watchers appointed to guard infected houses. For the first time, local governance was tied directly to national response. a small but vital step toward modern public health policy. Of course, the royals were not above hypocrisy. When plague raged, they fled the cities, but their vast travelling households, hundreds of servants, cooks and courtiers, often carried the disease with them. Royal progresses, the grand tours through the countryside that were meant to dazzle subjects, occasionally left behind small trails of infection and panic. The Queen is coming could inspire both joy and dread, depending on how many corpses the last town buried after her visit. Court physicians lived in constant fear of displeasing their royal patients. Henry VIII famously dismissed or banished doctors who failed to heal him, and Elizabeth demanded loyalty, secrecy and results. To treat a monarch was to walk a tightrope between divine expectation and human limitation. No one wanted to be the doctor who made the wrong diagnosis and ended up joining the patient in the next plague pit. Still, Tudor monarchs understood that public confidence in their health was a reflection of the nation's strength. A sick king meant a weak kingdom. A dying queen meant divine disfavour. So they performed wellness like a state ceremony, dining publicly, hosting small audiences, and issuing optimistic proclamations even as entire parishes perished. Appearances mattered more than medicine. In the end, the royal approach to illness was as much theatre as it was policy. Kings and queens fled, decreed and prayed, but their main strategy was distance, both physical and emotional. The people suffered while the crown endured, high above the city's smoke and sorrow. And yet, in their fear, the Tudors did inadvertently plant the seeds of public health, organisation, quarantine, and the faint recognition that survival required more than faith. It required planning. Until then, England's rulers kept their crowns polished, their sleeves perfumed, and their doors tightly closed. The royal prescription for plague was simple: stay regal, stay remote, and above all, stay elsewhere. If Tudor London were a living organism, its wealthiest citizens were the perfumed surface, the courtiers, merchants and nobles who bathed in rosewater and fled to the countryside at the first sniff of plague. The poor, meanwhile, were the city's lungs, overworked, underfed, and constantly choking on the fumes of everyone else's neglect. In the labyrinth of London's slums, disease wasn't a visitor, it was a roommate who never paid rent. If poverty didn't kill you, the bacteria sent a polite reminder. The Tudor poor lived crammed together in neighbourhoods like Southwark, Clerkenwell, and the stews along the Thames. These were worlds of timber houses stacked like tinder boxes, leaning so close across alleys that neighbours could shake hands through the windows, though it was safer not to. Families of 6, 8 or more shared single rooms, their walls damp and crawling with insects. Floors doubled as storage, dining tables and sleeping quarters, and sanitation consisted of a single bucket, emptied out the window with a warning cry of "Gardy Loo." If you were lucky, you heard it in time. If not, you wore the city's waster's perfume. Clean water was a rumour. The poor drew theirs from shared wells or public conduits, which were essentially open invitations for contamination. With no sewage system, waste seeped into everything: soil, wells, even the Thames itself, that grim artery of filth. People washed clothes in it, drank from it, and dumped corpses into it, all before breakfast. The result was a cycle of sickness so constant that a healthy day was less about feeling good and more about being functional enough to stand. Common diseases among the poor read like the world's least appealing shopping list: dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis, cholera, scurvy, and rickets. Childhood, if you survived it, was less an achievement and more a fluke. Infants died by the thousands. Midwives might deliver 3 babies in a day and bury 2 by nightfall. Malnutrition weakened everyone's immune system, making even a mild cough a potential death sentence. The body could only fight so many enemies while surviving on stale bread, weak ale, and hope. Food, when available, was often spoiled. The poor bought meat just before it rotted, because that was when it became affordable. Fish was sold from stalls where it had spent several days auditioning for sainthood. Milk was watered down, bread was stretched with chalk or sawdust, and vegetables were luxury items, unless you grew your own, in soil fertilised by the city's open cesspits. The Tudors believed in recycling long before it was fashionable, though not necessarily in ways that improved public health. And then there were the bugs. Fleas, lice and rats were not nuisances, they were roommates. Bedding was a buffet, hair was a habitat, and clothing doubled as pest housing. The poor rarely owned enough garments to rotate them, so infestations became permanent. Children scratched until they bled. Adults grew accustomed to constant itching, and everyone learned to live with the soft chorus of rustling fleas. Entire families slept in single beds for warmth, which also meant that when one person caught something, everyone else soon did too. When plague swept through London, the poor bore the brunt of it. Wealthier citizens could flee, but the poor had nowhere to go. The city's cramped alleys became breeding grounds for contagion. Quarantine measures, painting red crosses on infected doors, turned neighbourhoods into prisons. Those locked inside often starved long before the disease claimed them. Caring for the sick usually meant throwing food through the window and hoping it landed near the intended person. Compassion had limits, especially when the smell started to spread. Doctors rarely visited poor districts, and even if they did, few could afford their services. Apothecaries might sell cheap tonics made of vinegar and herbs, but these offered more scent than salvation. The real healers were mothers, midwives, and wise women armed with generations of folk remedies: chamomile for fever, mint for stomachaches, garlic for everything else. Sometimes the cures worked. More often they didn't, but belief was its own medicine. Religion filled the gap where medicine failed. Churches and parish officials served as the closest thing to a healthcare system. The poor were told to pray, confess, and accept illness as divine will. In the absence of explanation, faith offered meaning. If you got sick, it was God's test. If you recovered, it was God's mercy. And if you died, well, congratulations, you'd passed the test. The theology was simple, if not exactly reassuring. The poor also relied on one another. In London's tightest quarters, community was a survival strategy. Neighbours shared food, tools, and information, like which well hadn't yet turned foul or which alley was being fumigated. When plague came, they buried each other's dead, risked infection to comfort the dying, and cared for orphaned children. It wasn't organised charity, it was necessity. The state offered little more than laws against vagrancy and occasional barrels of vinegar for cleansing the air. London's poor didn't just live together, they died together, and they remembered. Even in their misery, they developed a grim humour about their circumstances. Jokes circulated about how fast death worked its way through certain streets, or how one could tell the living from the dead by who was still paying rent. Ballads about pestilence were sung in taverns between rounds of cheap ale. To laugh at death was not defiance, it was endurance. The Tudor poor may have lacked sanitation, but they had irony in abundance. The irony, of course, was that London's poor kept the city alive. They built its houses, baked its bread, cleaned its filth, and manned its markets. They were indispensable and invisible, the muscle and lungs of an empire in progress. Without them, the royal palaces would have grown cold and the great feasts empty. Yet when disease struck, it was always the poor who fell first, the poor who filled the plague pits, and the poor who were blamed for spreading it. By the end of the Tudor era, the government was beginning to recognise the obvious, that a city cannot thrive if its people are perpetually sick. Early forms of social aid emerged: parish relief for the sick, rudimentary hospitals for the destitute, and laws against dumping waste in the streets. Mostly ignored, but it was a start. These measures were small steps in a long journey towards something resembling public health. Still, for the slum dwellers of Tudor London, disease was not a passing threat, but a way of life. It lurked in their water, their air, their food, and their walls. Survival required a resilience that bordered on heroic. The Tudors built an empire on trade, conquest, and faith, but it was the poor who built it while coughing. For all their silk doublets, gold-threaded gowns, and perfumed palaces, Tudor nobles were as mortal as the rats under their floorboards. Money could buy you thicker walls, but it couldn't buy immunity. In a city where sickness flowed through every alley and river like a rumour, the upper classes merely got the luxury edition of the same problem. The rich didn't mingle with peasants, they just caught fancier diseases. To be wealthy in Tudor London was to live in constant contradiction. On one hand, you could afford servants, imported spices, and Italian physicians who spoke more Latin than sense. On the other, you lived in close quarters with those same servants, ate meat that was aged past good taste, and wore fashion that could probably kill you faster than poverty ever could. Health hazards came gilded and perfumed, wrapped in velvet and sometimes embroidered with your family crest. Take, for instance, the noble obsession with scent. The Tudor elite believed that good smells kept sickness away and that foul air carried disease, so they bathed in rosewater, stuffed their gloves with lavender, and burned sweet-smelling herbs in their chambers. Unfortunately, their perfume didn't just mask body odour, it also trapped dirt and bacteria in their clothing. Many of these fabrics were so rarely washed that they could have hosted their own ecosystem. The wealthy might have smelled like heaven, but they were cultivating microbial hell beneath the lace. Perfumed gloves became a deadly status symbol. Imported from France and Italy, they were soaked in oils, balms, and musk, some of which contained toxic substances like mercury and arsenic. Wearing them daily meant constant skin exposure to poison, but they looked exquisite, and fashion always trumped logic. Death by elegance wasn't just a metaphor, it was a lifestyle. Then there was the issue of servants. Every noble household swarmed with them: cooks, maids, butlers, grooms, tutors, pages, and footmen. They lived, worked, and sometimes slept within arm's reach of their masters. While the nobility might avoid the plague-stricken streets, their servants did not. They ran errands, fetched goods from markets, and interacted with the general public. When they returned, they brought back not just bread and gossip, but occasionally a bacterial souvenir. A Tudor noble's household could have more moving parts than a small village, and often the same hygiene. Servants bathed infrequently, shared sleeping quarters, and handled food, chamber pots, and linens all in one day's work. One sneeze in the scullery could become a fever in the master's bedchamber within a week. In short, the upper classes were separated from the poor by social rank, not microbial boundaries. The rich also travelled constantly. Henry VIII's court alone could move several hundred people at once: nobles, attendants, cooks, priests, jesters, and all their personal diseases. Palaces like Greenwich, Hampton Court, and Windsor acted like revolving doors for contagion. Each move spread sickness to a new area, while leaving behind half a ton of waste and at least one lingering infection. Imported luxury goods were another hazard. Silk from Italy, spices from the East, and even fine furs could carry fleas, lice, or dormant pathogens. There are records of outbreaks following the arrival of ships laden with precious goods, a polite euphemism for plagues with receipts. Wealth opened doors to the world, and the world politely sneezed back. And then there was diet. Nobles dined lavishly, with courses that could rival a modern buffet, but their indulgence was as dangerous as it was delicious. Meat-heavy diets led to gout, kidney stones, and heart disease. Sugar, newly popular and absurdly expensive, became an addiction among the elite. It rotted teeth, inflamed gums, and made faces swell. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, was said to have a smile that could light up a room, mostly because it reflected off her blackened, decayed teeth. Her apothecaries crafted sugary preserves that doubled as desserts and slow poison. The poor died of hunger, the rich died of excess. Medical care was another peculiar privilege. Wealthy families had access to physicians, but that didn't necessarily mean better outcomes. Tudor medicine was a hierarchy of confusion. Physicians prescribed, surgeons cut, and apothecaries mixed. A noble household might employ all three, ensuring that every illness got 3 wrong answers. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, and exotic ingredients like powdered emeralds or ground-up mummy. Yes, actual mummified remains imported from Egypt. If you were important enough, your medicine might literally contain royalty. Even the pursuit of beauty had a body count. Aristocratic women lathered their faces with ceruse, a white foundation made of vinegar and lead, to achieve the fashionable pale and pure look. It worked brilliantly, until it didn't. The lead seeped into the skin, causing paralysis, hair loss, and chronic illness. Combined with perfume poisoning and corsets that crushed internal organs, Tudor beauty routines could make a battlefield surgeon wince. Looking good was practically an act of self-harm in silk. Wealth also isolated the sick in a particularly cruel way. While the poor died among neighbours, the rich often died alone. Fear of contagion meant servants avoided sick masters, and family members fled estates at the first sign of plague. Nobles were locked in their chambers with candles, prayers, and physicians who wore masks stuffed with herbs in desperation. Private illness was a mark of status, and a sentence of solitude. Even the architecture conspired against them. Tudor mansions, with their heavy draperies, small windows and low ventilation trapped foul air. Fires burned constantly for warmth and purification, filling rooms with smoke and soot. The rich coughed from luxury while the poor coughed from poverty. The only difference was the thread count of their linens. And yet, for all their indulgence, the nobility couldn't fully escape the diseases of the commoners. Henry VIII's beloved brother, Prince Arthur, died young, likely of tuberculosis or sweating sickness. Nobles at court regularly succumbed to plague or infection, despite their precautions. Even the grandest titles couldn't buy the simplest gift: health. What distinguished the rich wasn't invincibility, but visibility. Their deaths were recorded, mourned, and memorialized in marble, while the poor vanished into the pits. But disease was the great equalizer, dragging everyone, lord or labourer, into the same graveyard earth. If the Tudors had a moral, it was this: plague did not discriminate, it merely preferred variety. In the end, Tudor luxury was a double-edged sword. Wealth brought comfort, but it also brought complacency. The rich built walls, burned incense, and wore poisons in pursuit of elegance. They may have looked like gods, but they lived and died like everyone else, coughing, fearful, and wondering which of their servants had just sneezed. In Tudor London, childhood wasn't a phase, it was a battlefield. From the moment a baby took its first breath, it was engaged in a daily contest with the universe to keep breathing. The best paediatric advice was try not to die before age 5. Children were the most vulnerable in a world that barely understood what made people sick. Infancy was a game of chance, and the odds were stacked steeply against survival. Disease, malnutrition, and poor sanitation cut through families like a scythe. A child born in Tudor London had perhaps a 50% chance of reaching adulthood. Half of all children died before they could learn to write their own names. For poor families, it was even worse. Babies were born into cramped, damp homes where rats made better nursery companions than toys. A newborn's first experience of Tudor life was usually baptism, and for good reason. The church insisted on baptizing infants within days, often within hours of birth, because no one could be sure how long they'd last. Clergymen even performed emergency baptisms if a baby looked faint or unpromising. It was the spiritual equivalent of giving them a head start to heaven. Parents mourned frequently, but they also grew hardened. They couldn't afford to weep forever when there were more mouths to feed and more children likely on the way. The causes of death were endless and tragically mundane. Infants died from infections that today would be cured by a spoonful of antibiotics. Fevers, rashes, coughs, and stomach bugs could turn fatal within days. Teething was considered a potentially deadly event. Some believed babies could overheat or take fever from the pain. In response, Tudor mothers rubbed honey, herbs, or if they could afford it, opium syrup on their baby's gums. A calm baby was a good sign, though often the peace came from sedation, not recovery. Medicine for children was little more than adult treatment scaled down by guesswork. Physicians and midwives recommended gentle purges for infants, mild laxatives made from herbs or milk, and bloodletting for older children who developed fevers. Yes, they bled children. The reasoning was the same as for adults. Sickness came from an imbalance of humours, and a few drops of blood would restore harmony. It rarely worked, but at least it was consistent. For external ailments, parents relied on folk remedies. Bread poultices, warm dough smeared on wounds or swellings were common. Honey believed to draw out corruption was applied to sores, burns, and just about anything that looked suspicious. Chamomile, mint and sage were boiled into teas for colic, while vinegar was splashed on foreheads to cool the brain. None of these were particularly effective, but they offered the illusion of care, and in a world where medicine and miracle blurred together, that counted for something. Midwives were the frontline medics of childhood. They delivered babies, tended to mothers, and acted as the local paediatric experts by default. Most were self-taught, their knowledge passed down through experience rather than books. They knew which herbs soothed crying infants and which ones made them stop crying permanently, an important distinction that not all Tudor doctors grasped. Their work was indispensable, but it also made them targets of suspicion. A child dying under a midwife's watch could spark accusations of incompetence or witchcraft. Diet played a huge role in childhood survival, though not always a positive one. Breastfeeding was encouraged, but many noble women considered it beneath their dignity and hired wet nurses instead. These nurses often cared for several infants at once, feeding them on rotation, which spread disease faster than gossip at court. Babies raised on animal milk or gruel fared worse. Cow's milk was unpasteurized and frequently contaminated, and porridge made from dirty water could kill as easily as starvation. Weaning fever, as it was called, was one of the great silent killers of Tudor babies. As children grew, they encountered a world filled with invisible dangers. Streets were open sewers, play areas doubled as refuse piles, and clean water was practically mythical. Cuts and scrapes easily turned septic. Eye infections, worms and lice were everyday companions. Parents used whatever they could find to fight back: soot, vinegar, even ashes mixed with water. One 16th century recipe recommended rubbing a sick child's chest with the grease of a hedgehog to cure coughs. The only thing it likely cured was the desire to breathe near them. Among the poor, superstition shaped childcare as much as medicine. Mothers hung charms above cradles to ward off the evil eye. Babies were swaddled so tightly they could barely move, a practice believed to protect their bones and also ensure their silence. Illness was often blamed on curses or sin. Prayers, holy water, and amulets were the first lines of defense. Doctors were for the rich, priests for the hopeful, and herbalists for everyone in between. Even among the nobility, privilege couldn't protect children entirely. Henry VIII lost 3 legitimate heirs before Edward VI survived long enough to inherit the throne, and even Edward died in his teens. Elizabeth I's childhood was shadowed by death and fear. Noble children were raised with tutors, but also with regular plagues, poxes, and political executions. Being royal didn't mean you were safe, it just meant your cradle had better embroidery. When noble children fell ill, the treatments were grander but no more effective. Physicians mixed elaborate tonics of saffron, sugar, and gold leaf for fevers, or bathed infants in wine to strengthen their humours. These exotic concoctions cost fortunes and achieved little, except to remind parents that wealth and wisdom rarely met in the same medicine bottle. Childhood was also perilous because no one quite understood growth itself. A sickly child might be declared doomed, while a robust one could die overnight from an infection no one saw coming. Death was so common that many families reused names. If baby John died, the next son would also be named John, as though the name itself might succeed where the body had failed. And yet, amid the death and dirt, love persisted. Tudor parents mourned deeply, even if they seemed stoic. Letters from the time reveal grief that transcends centuries. Mothers writing of the sweetness of my lost babe, fathers lamenting God's cruel taking. Every tiny grave in a churchyard carried a story of hope, loss, and endurance. Children who survived their first 5 years were seen as blessed. They became apprentices, servants, or scholars, already scarred by experience but stronger for it. To make it to adolescence was to prove your worth to the era itself. Tudor London didn't raise its children gently. It forged them through fever and faith. In a world without vaccines, clean water, or modern medicine, survival was an act of luck, resilience, and the relentless love of those who refused to stop trying, armed with nothing more than honey, bread, and prayer. Progress in Tudor London didn't arrive in shining armour. It limped in, smelling faintly of vinegar, clutching a bucket of filthy water and whispering, "Maybe we should wash our hands." It only took a few million deaths to realise maybe washing hands helps. The Tudors didn't discover modern medicine, but they accidentally laid its shaky, plague-splattered foundations. Disease was their most brutal teacher, and every epidemic a classroom where the lessons were written in sweat, pus, and panic. Though it would take centuries before microscopes replaced miasmas and antiseptics replaced incense, the Tudor era was the turning point where people began just barely to connect the dots between cleanliness, contagion, and survival. At the dawn of the 16th century, the concept of hygiene was more spiritual than physical. Purity meant moral cleanliness, not soap. Water was for drinking and occasionally baptizing, not for scrubbing. Most believed that bathing opened the pores and allowed illness to sneak in, which was ironic given that illness was already comfortably seated in their pores. But as outbreaks returned again and again, plague, smallpox, sweating sickness, the sheer repetition began to erode superstition. People started to notice that the dirtiest neighbourhoods were also the sickest. Coincidence? Maybe not. One of the first public health reforms came not from physicians, but from city officials who were simply tired of the smell. London's endless plagues forced the authorities to take drastic if inconsistent measures. The city began organising searches of the dead, grim record keepers, who inspected corpses and noted causes of death in parish registers. These early death bills weren't just morbid bookkeeping, they revealed patterns. If half of St Giles Parish died in a single month, perhaps something was going on besides divine displeasure. By Elizabeth I's reign, this information was being used to track outbreaks, prompting quarantines before entire districts fell. It wasn't exactly science, it was bureaucratic guesswork, but it marked the first time data, not just prayer, was used to confront disease. The Tudors didn't yet know why infection spread, but they knew where it spread, and that was enough to start fencing it in. Hygiene itself became a growing curiosity. Physicians and apothecaries began promoting cleanliness of living as a general virtue. The logic was still rooted in miasma theory, the idea that foul air caused sickness, but even false theories can lead to good habits. If you believed bad smells carried death, then scrubbing floors, burning herbs, and disposing of filth suddenly sounded wise. Street cleaning laws appeared, ordering citizens to clear waste and keep drains unblocked. The penalties were rarely enforced, but the message was spreading. Filth wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Quarantine also evolved from blind panic to crude policy. During major plagues, infected houses were sealed and marked with a red cross and the plea, "Lord, have mercy upon us." At first, this was less about saving lives and more about containing fear, but over time, officials refined the process, sending watchers to enforce isolation, paying nurse keepers to tend the confined, and fumigating homes after death. None of it worked perfectly, but it worked better than doing nothing. The seed of public responsibility for health had been planted, though it was watered mostly with tears. Even medicine, long trapped in the alchemical fog of humours and astrology, began to wobble toward reason. Some physicians, mostly those brave or curious enough to cut open bodies, started learning how disease affected anatomy. Dissection became less taboo, paving the way for real anatomy lessons. The Barber Surgeons' Company, once infamous for mixing haircuts with amputations, began setting standards for training and record keeping. Slowly, the body became less mystical and more mechanical, a system that could be studied, repaired, or in Tudor cases, mended with varying degrees of screaming. The spread of printing accelerated this quiet revolution. Medical texts, once locked away in Latin, were now printed in English, bringing health advice and occasionally dangerous nonsense to a wider audience. Pamphlets on plague prevention circulated among literate citizens, advising fresh air, herbal fumigation, and the new concept of avoiding the ill. Sure, some of it was superstition. Carrying dried toads and wearing jewels against infection never helped anyone, but the growing exchange of information mattered. The Tudors were learning to share knowledge instead of just rumours. Even domestic habits changed. Soap, once a luxury, became slightly more common, though many still preferred perfume to purity. People began washing their hands and faces more often, especially before meals. It wasn't quite the medical breakthrough of germ theory, but it hinted at intuition. Perhaps the things that make us smell bad also make us sick. Physicians even recommended airing out rooms, scrubbing bed linens, and burning old straw after illness. Primitive infection control, Tudor style. For the wealthy, illness sparked architectural evolution. Homes began featuring more windows for light and ventilation. Chimneys improved airflow, reducing the damp, smoky environments where disease thrived. Palaces and townhouses were designed with separate quarters for servants and kitchens, partly for privacy and partly because people were finally realising that living next to a latrine wasn't ideal for long-term health. Cleanliness was becoming fashionable, which in Tudor society meant it might actually catch on. But perhaps the most important lesson learned wasn't scientific at all, it was social. Each epidemic revealed that disease ignored class, title and piety. The rich could flee, but not always fast enough. The poor could pray, but not always loud enough. Over time, this realization, repeated across generations, fostered an early sense of shared vulnerability. When the plague came, Londoners saw that they lived and died together, and that survival required cooperation, quarantines, shared wells, community watchmen, and civic order. It wasn't compassion alone that kept the city alive. It was practicality dressed as morality. The Tudors also left behind a crucial legacy: documentation. Their obsessive record-keeping of births, deaths, and diseases would become the foundation for the statistical studies of later centuries. Without their grim ledgers, the scientists of the Enlightenment would have had nothing to analyse. Out of all their ignorance and fear came a gift: the data that would one day prove that dirt, not demons, killed people. By the time the Tudor era closed, England had not yet discovered germs, but it had discovered responsibility. The people still believed in divine punishment, but they had started building drains. They still carried poses against the plague, but they were beginning to boil their water. It wasn't progress you could see in a single reign, but in the long march of muddy centuries, it was monumental. The Tudors didn't conquer disease, but they started asking the right questions. What if filth mattered? What if isolation helped? What if prevention was better than prayer? Those tentative smudged questions would lead hundreds of years later to soap, sanitation, and surgery that didn't end in infection. It's easy to laugh now knowing what they didn't, but every modern hospital, every vaccination, and every clean glass of water has a little Tudor in its ancestry, a faint echo of a desperate Londoner muttering, "Next time, let's try washing first." When you walk through modern London past its parks, polished cafes, and perfectly civilised plumbing, it's easy to forget that beneath your feet lies the ghost of Tudor disease. Literally, the city is built on layers of bones, centuries of burial pits, and the restless sleep of those who never got a headstone. The Tudors didn't just shape England's monarchy or fashion, they reshaped its very soil. We may have medicine now, but we still panic when someone sneezes in public. The epidemics of Tudor London left more than graves. They left memory, architecture, and instinct. The city that once smelled like a compost heap now prides itself on cleanliness, but its obsession with hygiene is born directly from its filthiest past. Modern sewers, sanitation laws, and even social etiquette all trace back to the centuries when disease was a daily companion. Every time someone says "cover your mouth," you can thank the ghosts of 16th century London for that advice. You can still find the physical marks of the plagues that shaped the city. Many of London's green spaces, Finsbury Fields, Charterhouse Square, and St James's Park began as plague pits or overflow cemeteries. The ground that hosts picnics and joggers today was once dug by exhausted men burying hundreds at a time by torchlight. When construction crews in modern London hit unexpected obstacles, it's often a polite way of saying, "We've found more Tudors." Every generation builds higher, but the city's foundations remain stubbornly mortal. Architecture itself evolved in response to disease. Tudor London's cramped wooden houses and shared courtyards were plague factories. When fire tore through the city in 1666, it inadvertently completed what the Tudors had only begun, a mass sanitation project by way of combustion. The rebuilt city favoured wider streets, stone buildings, and better ventilation. Ideas already whispered by Tudor reformers who had noticed that narrow alleys and bad air tended to produce corpses. The Great Fire may have purified London in flame, but the spark of that reform came from Tudor desperation. Even the way Londoners lived and interacted changed forever. Public hygiene became a civic duty, not just a personal virtue. The plague orders of Elizabeth I laid the groundwork for citywide health administration, the ancestors of today's councils, inspectors, and public health officials. Tudor watchmen who guarded infected houses were the first contact tracers. The death registries kept by parishes became the data that later scientists used to map epidemics. Without Tudor paranoia, modern epidemiology might never have been born, and yet not all their legacies are rational. Superstition clung to the English psyche like a lingering fever. Tudor Londoners blamed witches, sinners, and foul vapours for their misery. And though we've traded holy water for hand sanitizer, the impulse remains. A cough on the tube and an entire carriage flinches. We may know about bacteria and viruses now, but emotionally we're still Tudors at heart. Half science, half superstition, fully suspicious. Even language carries their fingerprints. Quarantine, pest house, and miasma all entered English during or shortly after the Tudor period. Expressions like cleanliness is next to godliness, and an ounce of prevention were moral echoes of hard-won experience. We still say bless you after a sneeze, not because we fear the devil, but because our ancestors once did. These tiny linguistic fossils remind us that culture evolves, but fear doesn't fade, it just changes costume. Religion too absorbed the lessons of disease. After centuries of plague, sermons grew obsessed with morality and mortality. Churches redesigned burial grounds, banning overcrowded churchyards in favour of new cemeteries on the outskirts of town. The once casual proximity between the living and the dead became uncomfortable. Walls rose higher around graveyards, and burial rituals grew solemn, organised, and bureaucratic. Death was no longer a daily visitor but a managed event, a strange kind of progress born from exhaustion. Medicine took its longest stride forward not through invention, but through reflection. By the end of the Tudor era, Londoners had learned through trial, error, and tragedy that illness was not random. Clean air mattered, containment worked, data saved lives. The physicians of later centuries would build on that scaffold, armed with microscopes and microscopes worth of humility. Every clean hospital ward, every antiseptic bandage, owes a faint debt to those who once tried to fight plague with garlic necklaces and good intentions. The Tudors also taught the world a quieter truth, that survival depends as much on community as on medicine. During the worst epidemics, London's poor buried each other, shared food, and kept one another alive when the rich fled. That spirit of collective endurance outlasted the dynasty itself. When COVID or cholera strike centuries later, humanity still responds with echoes of Tudor solidarity. Part fear, part faith, and part stubborn refusal to surrender. Walk through London today, and you'll see it everywhere. In the city's insistence on clean water, in its parks planted over old cemeteries, in its hospitals that bear the names of medieval saints who once tended the dying. The capital still carries the memory of disease in its bones, and that memory hums quietly under the noise of modern life. The skyline may have changed, but the story beneath it remains the same. Survival through adaptation, one outbreak at a time, and in the end, that's the strange comfort of the Tudor legacy. Their world was filthy, fearful, and fatalistic, but it forced humanity to evolve, not through brilliance, but through necessity. The Tudors never solved the mysteries of disease, but they taught future generations to ask better questions, to clean the streets, to keep records, and above all, to never take health for granted. So the next time someone sneezes in public and a dozen heads turn in synchronized alarm, remember it's not just anxiety, it's history sneezing through us. The Tudors may be long gone, but their lessons remain alive in every cautious glance, every hand wash, every nervous cough stifled on a crowded train. London endured because they didn't give up. We endure because they didn't stop learning.